Hey guys, tonight we're slipping past guards and ghosts into the mirrored dreams of Versailles, where scandal once wore silk and secrets drifted like perfume through candlelit halls. You're stepping lightly, very lightly, down polished floors that whisper with centuries of footsteps, and just so you know, you probably won't survive this. You're not royalty, you're not even nobility. You're a curious little time traveller with no business peeking into the personal affairs of queens and they're very much not their husbands. Still, you're here. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in France, Versailles to be specific. The 1770s. The walls glow with gilded gold and candlelight, and everything smells like lilies, powdered wigs, and the soft decay of secrets left in the corners too long. There's music. Violins, laughter, fans fluttering. You pass rooms full of whispers, but you're not here for politics or pastries. You're here for love. Well, the forbidden kind. The kind that gets you exiled, executed, or made into centuries-old gossip. You peek through a crack in a door carved with roses. Inside she sits, Marie Antoinette. Not yet headless, but definitely restless. She's draped in satin like a doll, and near her, too near, is Count Axel von Fersen. Tall, handsome, Swedish. He looks at her like he's memorizing her face for a portrait he'll never be allowed to keep. You watch their eyes dance past each other, careful but full of fire. They never touch, at least not here, not in public. But they don't need to. People say she was a flighty queen, obsessed with fashion and cake. That's what history books like to reduce her to. But right now, in this still moment, she's just a young woman with way too many expectations piled onto her powdered shoulders. And he's one of the few people who treats her like something other than a political pawn. Now, historians debate this affair. Some insist their relationship was emotional, but never consummated, whatever that means. Others point to the unusually affectionate letters between them, full of missing lines and suspicious code words. Love? Lust? Who knows? What is certain is that they trusted each other completely. So much that when it came time for the royal family to flee the revolution, guess who helped coordinate it? That's right, Fersen. You're with them now as the plan unfolds. Hidden carriages, disguises, passports forged by trembling hands. Marie Antoinette wears a veil and the children are bundled tight. Her husband, King Louis XVI, moves with an awkward shuffle. He's not exactly built for espionage. And Fersen, he's the shadow that makes it all possible. But here's the tragedy. The plan fails. A postmaster recognises the king's face from a coin. The family is arrested in Varennes, and their escape comes to a crushing halt. Fersen? He slips away, heart pounding, knowing he may never see her again. You sit beside him now, in a dark Paris apartment. He drinks, writes, paces. Eventually, he pens more letters to Marie, but who knows if she reads them? She's imprisoned, then tried. You don't want to watch what comes next, but you do. You're there as the cart rolls over the cobblestones. You hear the crowd, you see the blade. Later, after her death, Fersen never marries. He stays loyal to her memory, wearing black, keeping her letters, aging alone. Some say he was obsessed, others call it devotion. His fate, also grim. In 1810, he's beaten to death by a mob, accused of poisoning the Swedish crown prince. No trial, no mercy, just rage and silence. Here's a quirky detail most people miss. Some of Marie Antoinette's letters to Fersen were written with invisible ink. Yes, really. Lemon juice and heat-revealed confessions. You imagine her hunched over a desk, praying no one discovers them. Those letters still exist, but the French National Archives blacked out several sections. Recently, modern technology revealed the redacted words, and guess what? They're full of longing. The kind you don't write to a pen pal. And here's something for the scholars. Was Fersen the biological father of her youngest child, the second Dauphin? Some historians say no way, too risky. Others point to timelines, likenesses, and Marie's unusually defensive behaviour about that child. Still, no DNA test has been done, and probably never will be. Some secrets are too royal to dig up. You wander through the Hall of Mirrors now, your breath fogging as it meets the cold air. Their story lingers here, like perfume, a love that existed in glances, letters, and maybe, just maybe, a few stolen nights beneath heavy velvet curtains. Your hand brushes the marble. You think about how thin the line is between love and doom when you wear a crown. One misstep and you're not just heartbroken, you're history. You step back through the secret door, back into the present, the click of your shoes echoing through time. You're one scandal down, 29 to go. The palace grows colder as you drift forward in time, though the flickering torchlight never quite fades. You're still in the world of royalty, but now you've stepped into the stone corridors of Elizabethan England. The air here is heavy with incense, ink and anticipation. Velvet drapes everything. Curtains, gowns, pride. And watching over all of it, with hawk-sharp eyes and a powdered face set like marble, is Elizabeth the Virgin Queen, they called her. But as you sneak through the shadows of Whitehall Palace, you realise the title might not mean quite what the poets sang. She sits on the throne, stiff-backed, surrounded by courtiers who whisper behind lace sleeves, but it's one man who draws her eyes again and again, Robert Dudley. Childhood friend, favourite, maybe more. His dark eyes sparkle with the sort of familiarity you only get from growing up in the same royal lion's den. He knows her real laugh, not the diplomatic one. He knows her temper too, and doesn't flinch when it lashes out. You hide behind a carved screen and watch as their bodies stay formally apart, but their glances speak novels. The court knows, everyone knows. Gossip drips from the walls like candle wax. But there's a problem, a very dead one. Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart. You hear the name in whispers, in prayers, in scandalised oaths. One morning in 1560 she is found, at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck. Some say it was illness, others a tragic accident. But the juicier theory, that she was pushed, maybe by someone working for Dudley. Maybe so he could finally be free to marry Elizabeth. You move through the rooms as the aftermath unfolds. The Queen doesn't marry him. Can't. Won't. The scandal's too hot. The timing too perfect. Marrying him now would have been political suicide. Still, she keeps him close. He becomes the Earl of Leicester. Gets a fancy house right next to hers. They exchange letters laced with pet names, hers to him often signed, "Your loving and obedient servant," which you have to admit is pretty wild coming from one of the most powerful women in European history. Historians argue over what really happened to Amy Robsart. Some maintain she had breast cancer and brittle bones, and her death really was an accident. Others insist she was murdered to clear the path for a royal marriage that never happened anyway. The only thing not up for debate, the effect it had on Elizabeth. After Amy's death, she starts to play a different game, carefully wielding her single status as a political tool. She dangles the possibility of marriage before kings and princes like a carrot on a jewelled stick, keeping alliances just unstable enough to control. You watch Dudley age beside her, always near, never quite having her. He marries again, secretly at first. The Queen finds out and her rage is volcanic. You feel the tension in the tapestries. Her betrayal isn't just romantic, it's strategic. She gave him power, influence, rooms in her palace, and he, in turn, promised undivided loyalty. To break that bond, even for a noblewoman like Lettice Knollys, is to challenge the very essence of Elizabeth's rule. Lettice is banished from court, forever. And Dudley? He wins his way back, of course, but never quite to where he once stood. Now here's a fun fact buried in the court archives. Dudley had a secret laboratory. He was a big fan of alchemy, and spent a good chunk of time trying to turn base metals into gold, which, considering the metaphor of his relationship with Elizabeth, feels a little on the nose. Alchemy was the science of impossible transformations, something Dudley understood too well. Try as he might, he couldn't transmute friendship into marriage. And if you want a weird fringe theory, here's one to swirl around your sleepy brain. Some have suggested that Elizabeth and Dudley were secretly married all along, or at least had a child in secret. A boy, hidden away, perhaps raised by trusted courtiers. There's no real evidence for it, but every few decades someone claims to be a descendant. It's the kind of mystery that historians frown at but novelists drool over. You linger now in Elizabeth's private chambers, where her bed is surrounded by thick curtains and her writing desk overflows with scrolls. She's older now. Her hair, once red gold, is a wig. Her teeth are mostly gone, but her mind still sharp enough to skewer. She holds a locket with Dudley's portrait inside. It's worn, maybe even kissed. She carries it until the day she dies. Dudley goes first, 1588. You're there in the garden at Kenilworth when he dies, quietly. The Queen gets the letter and locks herself away, refusing food, refusing counsel. She emerges days later, pale but composed, and never speaks his name aloud again. But she keeps his last letter, clutched like a relic. You realise now that love for Elizabeth was both her greatest strength and her cruelest tether. She used it as leverage, yes, but it also kept her bound. Her reign, the so-called Golden Age, was painted in the colours of restraint, image, and self-sacrifice. She was married to her country, she said, but she loved Dudley. Maybe not the way bards write about, but deeply, enduringly. You step back through a tapestry into a corridor dusted with age. The candle in your hand flickers. You're starting to see a pattern already. When kings love dangerously, they lose crowns. When queens do it, they lose their reputations. Or worse. Love is a luxury royalty can't afford, but that doesn't stop them from reaching for it. You glance over your shoulder, half expecting Elizabeth's eyes to follow you, and in a way they do. Portraits of her hang like warnings down every hallway. They don't blink, but they don't have to. You press forward into the next chapter, where another queen waits. And this one? She's got a lover who may have murdered her husband, and you're about to be way too close for comfort. There's a storm trailing behind you as you step into Scotland, and it feels like the sky itself is warning you not to get involved. You do anyway, obviously, because right now Mary, Queen of Scots, is standing at a window with her back to the chaos she helped create. Her fingers trace the glass like she's writing something she can't say aloud. Outside, the heather moors stretch forever, mist curling like ghosts between the hills. Inside, though, inside is far more haunted. Mary is beautiful, they say. Tall, cultured, clever, fluent in multiple languages and raised in the French court. But all that elegance hasn't protected her from what's waiting in the dark corners of her reign, like her choice of husbands. You crouch behind a tapestry as she welcomes Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, into her chambers. He's charming, sure. Good-looking, definitely. And unfortunately also arrogant, reckless, and not nearly as smart as he thinks he is. At first, their marriage is passionate, political, maybe even hopeful, but that shine dulls fast. You're there for the arguments, the jealousy. Darnley's temper exploding over Mary's friendships, especially her closeness with her Italian secretary David Rizzio. And then, the moment that turns a love story into something else entirely. March 9th, 1566. Darnley bursts into Mary's supper room with a group of nobles. You press yourself flat against the stone wall as they stab Rizzio over 50 times, right in front of a pregnant Mary. The blood soaks into the floorboards. It stays there, a stain that never quite disappears. After that, the marriage is more corpse than union. Mary loathes him. Darnley becomes paranoid, sickly, and isolated. And now you meet the next player, James Hepburn, the 4th Earl of Bothwell. Rough around the edges, war-hardened, loyal, or so it seems. He and Mary begin circling each other like storm clouds. Some say she falls for him, others say he uses her. Either way, what happens next makes even seasoned courtiers flinch. In February 1567, Darnley is recovering from illness at Kirkhofield, a house just outside Edinburgh. You're nearby, crouched in the shadow of the crumbling gate. Midnight. A blast rips through the silence. The house is reduced to rubble, but Darnley's body is found outside the ruins, unburned, but very much dead. Strangled, they say. It's not just murder, it's a spectacle. And Bothwell? He's widely suspected. There's a trial, but it's a joke. He's acquitted. Then, weeks later, yes, weeks, Mary marries him. The public reaction is exactly what you'd expect. Outrage. Rebellion. A queen marrying her husband's probable killer. It doesn't go over well. You attend the wedding in disguise, and honestly, it's tense. She looks pale. He looks smug. And you wonder if this is love or blackmail. Some historians believe she was forced into the marriage, kidnapped even. Others argue she acted out of passion or desperation. It doesn't last. A few months later, Mary is imprisoned at Loch Leven Castle. You float through her cell now, bare stone walls, draughty windows, the weight of regret heavy enough to knock the wind out of you. She's forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son. Bothwell flees, is captured, dies insane in a Danish prison. The romance ends in shackles and sea spray. Here's your quirky detail. Before Darnley died, he had taken to wearing armour to bed out of fear for his life. Imagine trying to sleep in full metal gear while your marriage is collapsing and your secretary has just been murdered in front of you. That's not just dysfunctional, it's almost Shakespearean, which of course inspired actual Shakespeare. Some scholars think parts of Hamlet, especially the ghostly father and the treacherous queen, echo Mary's saga. And here's the open debate. How involved was Mary in Darnley's murder? Some say she knew everything and let it happen. Others think she was manipulated, pushed into a corner. There are letters, possibly forged, that suggest she and Bothwell plotted it together. Historians call them the casket letters, and to this day, no one agrees if they're legit. If they are, they're scandalous. If not, they're one of the dirtiest political smears in history. Eventually, Mary escapes Loch Leven. You watch her ride through the rain, her dress soaked, her crown lost somewhere in the mud. She seeks refuge in England, but spoiler alert, that goes terribly. Elizabeth I locks her up for nearly 20 years before signing her death warrant. You're in the room the morning Mary walks to the block in 1587, regal to the end in a velvet gown, crimson petticoat underneath, martyr's red. She forgives her executioner, he swings, misses the first time, the second time works, the third is for good measure. What remains of her story is stained with blood and conflicting loyalties. Was she a tragic romantic, a reckless queen, a political pawn, all of the above? You step away from the scaffold, boots damp with history. There's a cold wind at your back and the sound of bagpipes in the distance. They don't mourn her exactly, but they remember. The thing about forbidden love in royalty is that it rarely ends with just heartbreak. There are bodies, scandals, exiles, and the ghosts, they stay. Mary's story is one long echo of what happens when a queen dares to follow her heart and chooses wrong. You glance over your shoulder, half expecting her to be there, but she's not. Just the wind and the echo of something torn between power and passion. You keep moving. The next affair on your list isn't European at all. You're about to trade castles for courtyards and powdered wigs for Mughal pearls. Love still isn't allowed, but that's never stopped anyone before. The air is thick with jasmine and dust as you slip quietly into the world of Mughal India. It's the late 1500s, and you're stepping through intricately carved archways under a violet sky, where moonlight plays on the marble of palace courtyards. The scent of sandalwood clings to your clothes, and the soft rustle of silk slippers echoes somewhere nearby. You're inside the imperial zenana, the women's quarters, a maze of veils and secrets, where voices speak softly but the consequences of what's whispered can shake an empire. This is where love is not only forbidden, it's considered treason. You find a shadowy corner in a colonnaded walkway, watching a young prince stroll beneath lanterns that sway like breathing ghosts. This is Prince Salim, son of the great Emperor Akbar, the heir to one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in the world. He's confident, poetic, bold, and something in his eyes tells you he's already burning with defiance. Because following close behind, veiled and nearly silent, is a woman history only knows by legend. Anarkali. No one agrees if she was real. Some say she was a dancer, others a slave, a courtesan, or even a woman of noble Persian blood. What they do agree on is this: she was not royal, and she most definitely was not approved. But to Salim, she is irresistible. You see it in the way he stops to catch a glimpse of her face under the moonlight, in the way she lingers too long in doorways. Their love blooms in stolen moments, poems passed like contraband, late-night encounters guarded by bribed eunuchs, letters hidden in the folds of silk. Akbar, the emperor, is not amused. You're in the council chamber as his advisors whisper about the boy's growing obsession. There's concern, not just about propriety, but about politics. If Salim marries a woman of a low rank, especially one with no political alliance attached, he could destabilize the entire succession. The Mughal court isn't just a palace, it's a battlefield dressed in gold. Every marriage is a treaty, every child a chess piece. The tension builds until it's too much. You're outside a chamber one night when Salim openly challenges his father, refusing to abandon Anarkali. The confrontation is loud, brutal, and full of centuries-old expectations crashing down. Akbar doesn't bend. Salim storms off. You feel the tremor in the walls. What happens next depends on who you ask. In one version, Akbar imprisons Anarkali. In another, she's sentenced to death, sealed alive inside a wall of brick somewhere in the palace grounds. You stand silently as labourers lay the final bricks, sweat glistening on their backs under the unforgiving sun. The last sound from within is, supposedly, her voice reciting a love poem to Salim. Whether it's true or just embroidered legend, you can't say, but it's horrifying and unforgettable. In yet another version, Akbar fakes her execution and secretly helps her escape the empire to spare his son deeper pain. She disappears into Persia, they say, or maybe she dies in a distant province, never knowing if Salim ever forgave his father. It's the kind of story that changes depending on who's telling it, and whether they want a tragedy or a redemption arc. One quirky detail. In Lahore, Pakistan, there is a mausoleum that locals insist is Anarkali's tomb. It bears a Persian inscription that translates to, "Ah, if I could behold the face of my beloved once more, I would thank Allah until the day of resurrection." No royal seal, no grand ceremony, just a quiet stone, full of aching words, and no official confirmation. It might be her, or someone else entirely. The ambiguity only makes it more romantic. And here's your scholarly debate. Did Anarkali even exist? Some academics think she's a total fabrication, an allegory for disobedience or a fictional muse invented by later poets. Others argue there's enough evidence in court records and oral traditions to suggest she was real, just carefully erased from official Mughal history. After all, nothing terrifies an empire more than a love story it can't control. Eventually, Salim becomes emperor himself, Emperor Jahangir, and though he marries many women, you notice a hollow note in his court poetry. He never speaks Anarkali's name again, but his art is filled with longing. His paintings, with veiled women who all look suspiciously similar. Some say he built that tomb in Lahore himself, in secret, as a final tribute. You leave the Mughal palace through a garden where the marble fountains still flow, though their water seems quieter somehow. Night has fallen, and the moon reflects in every tiled surface. Anarkali may be legend, but you felt her here, drifting between jasmine trees and moonlit halls. Her story, like so many forbidden royal loves, is half truth, half myth, and entirely unforgettable. And as you walk away, the wind picks up. You think you hear music, a sitar, faint and mournful. Maybe it's just your imagination, or maybe, just maybe, the stories never really leave the walls where they were born. They only wait for someone bold, or foolish enough to come listen again. You tighten your cloak. You've heard whispers of Napoleon next, but this one isn't about Josephine, not the famous one anyway. This time, the emperor falls for a Polish noblewoman who changes everything. And you'll be right there, hiding in a carriage when it happens. The cobblestones clatter beneath the wheels of a sleek private carriage as you lurch across Europe, trading Mughal marble for the musk of velvet and gunpowder. It's the early 1800s, and you're bumping along the Polish countryside under a sky so grey it feels like the whole continent is holding its breath. You peek through a fogged window at the figure inside. His hat's on the seat beside him, the iconic bicorn slightly crushed from hours of travel. His hand rests on a bundle of letters he hasn't opened yet. The man, Napoleon Bonaparte. And despite all the wars and crowns, he's about to do something completely ill-advised, fall headfirst into a love that's both politically toxic and painfully real. She's not Josephine, she's not a crown princess or a dazzling duchess. She's Maria Walewska, a Polish countess, young, idealistic, and astonishingly beautiful in that tragic faded winter way. And what you're about to witness isn't just an affair, it's a collision between empire and identity, where passion meets propaganda and leaves neither intact. The thing is, this starts off all wrong. Napoleon doesn't meet Maria at a ball or a quiet salon. He's introduced to her by a group of Polish nobles who, essentially, offer her to him. Not for love, but to curry favour with the Emperor in hopes he'll help re-establish a free Poland. Romantic, right? You're there, standing awkwardly in the corner of a lavish room in Warsaw, when Napoleon first sees her. She's wearing white, always white, a symbol of peace and purity and passive patriotism. She's married, of course, because everyone in these stories seems to be. But her husband is older, distant, and not particularly concerned about fidelity. Maria looks up at Napoleon, and in that moment, something strange happens. She doesn't flirt, she doesn't perform, she simply meets his gaze, and he's smitten. At first she resists. That's not just legend, that's documented. You follow her carriage home one night, the wheels squeaking through snow, as she writes in her journal about how disgusting the whole proposition is. She's not naive, she knows what's being asked of her, but over time something changes. Maybe it's his persistence, maybe it's the vision of a restored Poland, maybe it's just him. Because despite being power-drunk and famously egotistical, Napoleon has moments of vulnerability that she seems to see. Eventually she gives in. They begin meeting in private, first in Warsaw, then in Vienna, then across the borders of empire like two magnets caught in history's current. You slip into their hideaway apartment, where the walls are lined with maps and Maria's gloves are draped carelessly over a campaign chair. He reads her poetry. She writes him letters filled with tender panic. What begins as political seduction turns into something surprisingly soft. But of course, this is Napoleon, and love doesn't come without strategy. He's still married to Josephine, whose inability to produce an heir gnaws at the edges of his ambition. And when Maria becomes pregnant with his child, things start to get complicated. You see her hesitate to tell him. You're beside her, she rubs her belly, unsure whether this new life is a blessing or a trap. She gives birth to a son, Alexandre. You hold your breath as she cradles him in a silk-wrapped cot, her face lit with something between pride and dread. Napoleon sends her gifts, money, but not a crown. He will never legitimize her or the child. He eventually divorces Josephine, but marries an Austrian archduchess instead. Politics again, empire again, and yet he keeps loving Maria in quiet ways. He visits when he can, writes when he can't. She remains loyal even after he falls. You follow her through the chaos of his final campaigns, always just behind, cloaked in anonymity. Even after Waterloo, even when he's exiled to Elba and then to St. Helena, her loyalty doesn't fully waver. She writes of him not as an emperor, but as a man, flawed, broken human. Here's your offbeat fact. When Napoleon visited Maria in 1809, he disguised himself in a Polish uniform to avoid recognition. Yes, the self-declared Emperor of the French cosplaying as one of her countrymen just to slip through the snow to her side. The image alone is worth pausing on. Boots damp, medals tucked away, heart completely exposed. And for the scholars, here's the lingering question. Did Maria truly love him, or was she performing her patriotism through submission? Some argue she was coerced, at first by her countrymen, later by her own desire to protect her child's future. Others insist her letters reveal deep affection, even devotion. And then there's the third theory, that theirs was a love that began in duty and evolved, painfully, into something real, something messy, something tragic. You follow Maria in her final years. She marries again, lives quietly, dies young, just 31. Her body is eventually buried in Poland, but her heart, literally, is placed in a crystal urn and interred in Paris beside her son's, because of course it is. Of course this love story ends with the disembodied heart encased in glass. You're beginning to notice a theme. Now you step away from their portrait, Napoleon stern, Maria wistful, and you feel the cold again. The air smells like old paper and regret. Another love, another throne, another woman remembered not for what she wanted, but for who she loved. The next door creaks open, and it smells of incense and something far more superstitious. You're heading to Spain now, where the Habsburg court is thick with cousins, curses, and a love so twisted it might actually have been doomed by blood itself. Spain welcomes you like a haunted cathedral, dark velvet tapestries, endless corridors, and the dry scent of incense clinging to everything. You're inside the Alcazar of Madrid, and everything about it feels uneasy. Even the chandeliers look like they're holding their breath. The year is somewhere in the late 1600s, and the man sitting alone beneath the heavy shadows of a painted ceiling is Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. You wouldn't call him handsome, you wouldn't even call him healthy, but right now, you're not here for judgment. You're here because even this cursed king tried to love, and what unfolded was a forbidden royal affair tangled not in scandal, but in centuries of inbreeding, paranoia, and deep Catholic dread. Charles is young but looks older, his jaw juts forward awkwardly. The infamous Habsburg jaw, more than just a nickname. It's practically a geological formation. His speech is slurred, his body frail, his mind clouded by seizures and superstition. You're watching history slow unravel, and yet behind his troubled face there's something oddly innocent, maybe even tender. You learn quickly he wants love. Real love. Not a strategic alliance, not another cousin-bound treaty. He wants warmth. But love doesn't come easily to kings like Charles, not when you're considered more omen than monarch. Now, here's where things turn. His first marriage, to Marie-Louise of Orléans, was political, of course. She was French, bright, well-liked, and utterly miserable in the suffocating Spanish court. You're there in the garden when she confides in her handmaiden that she dreads the night, not because of Charles, but because of the pressure to produce an heir. The court monitors her body like a sacred calendar, and despite her youth and his desperate hope, she never gets pregnant. She grows thinner, quieter. You spot her sometimes wandering alone in black lace, eyes wide like she's always halfway between fear and escape. But you notice something else too, the way Charles watches one of the ladies-in-waiting, his cousin, Maria Anna of Neuburg. At first it seems innocent, just shared glances in the chapel, an extra beat of conversation during court rituals. But you know how this goes. Proximity becomes affection. Affection turns into rumour, and rumour, in a royal court, is halfway to political warfare. When Marie-Louise dies suddenly in 1689, the whispers grow louder. Some say it was melancholy, others say poison. You're there when the doctors argue, too loudly, over her cause of death, while the priests mutter about the devil's influence. But in the spaces between science and prayer, suspicion falls on Maria Anna. Did she want the throne? Did Charles want her too much? It's unclear, and no one's willing to speak plainly, but not long after Charles marries her, and now the forbidden becomes official. Maria Anna is clever, German-born, deeply devout, and fully aware of the nightmare she stepped into. She plays her role carefully, balancing Charles's affection with her own ambitions. You catch them in quiet moments, him reading slowly from a prayer book while she adjusts his cloak, him staring at her like she might be the only thing in the room that makes sense. There's something childlike in the way he needs her, something tragic, but the political pressure doesn't lift. If anything, it crushes them harder. Still no child, still no heir. The court turns on Maria Anna the way it turned on Marie-Louise. Accusations of witchcraft start to slither through the halls. You're at a midnight mass when a servant is caught burying a chicken heart under the palace steps, supposedly to lift a curse. The Inquisition gets involved. Yes, the actual Spanish Inquisition. And suddenly the royal bedroom becomes ground zero for exorcisms and holy water. Here's the quirky twist. Charles was so obsessed with finding out why he couldn't father a child that he ordered his dead relatives exhumed for signs of curses. No joke. You shiver as you stand beside a cracked marble tomb, watching royal corpses get poked for unnatural signs. He even had entire teams of astrologers and mystics on royal salary. They'd chart the stars, burn herbs, and declare vague reasons why nothing, especially love, was working in his favour. And here's the big debate among historians. Was Charles's love for Maria Anna genuine, or was she just the last in a long line of pawns meant to distract from the empire's genetic collapse? Some scholars argue that Charles adored her in his own broken way, clinging to her as both wife and nurse. Others believe she used his weakness to increase her political influence, especially near the end when she manoeuvred to control succession plans. The truth, as always, hides between the lines of 100 conflicting letters. When Charles dies in 1700, childless and exhausted, the Habsburg line in Spain dies with him. You're in the chamber when it happens, the light from a single candle flickering as the Holy Roman legacy crumbles like old plaster. Maria Anna weeps, or at least looks like she does. Her grip on the throne is gone, the Bourbon line takes over, France wins, Spain changes forever. But in the old wing of the Alcazar, you pass a faded portrait, Charles and Maria Anna together. Not regal, not triumphant, just strange and slightly off-kilter, like everything about their love. It wasn't forbidden in the usual sense. No adultery, no scandalous trysts. But it felt wrong from the start, like nature itself objected, and maybe it did. After all, their bloodline had been folding in on itself for centuries. By the time Charles tried to love, his body and his crown were too fractured to hold anything whole. You step out into the fading Spanish sun, the city quieter than before. This story didn't end in romance or exile. It ended in extinction. But you sense the pain still lingers, trapped in the corners of ancient chapels and candlelit bedrooms. Next, you're going to Tudor England again, but not to Henry. This time, it's his sister, a royal woman who dared to marry for love and drag the entire dynasty into scandal just for a few kisses and a crownless husband. England again, but now it's 1515, and the Tudor court smells like rosewater and ambition. You duck beneath a heavy tapestry and emerge in Greenwich Palace, where everyone speaks too loudly and bows too deeply, afraid of offending someone with too much power and not enough patience. The glittering star of the moment is King Henry VIII, not yet the bloated tyrant of later years, but already carrying himself like a man who believes history exists solely to orbit him. But tonight, you're not trailing him. You're here for his sister, Mary Tudor, and the chaos she unleashes by doing something truly outrageous. Marrying for love. Mary is everything a Tudor princess should be. Regal, sharp-eyed, stubborn. But unlike her brother, who will bulldoze 6 marriages to get a son, Mary only wants one man, and unfortunately, he's not the one she's ordered to wed. She's in her teens when she's sent to France to marry the elderly King Louis XV. It's a strategic alliance, not a love match. You ride in the carriage beside her, feeling the way her breath fogs the window, how the lace of her sleeves trembles with every bump in the road. She knows what's waiting, an old king with a bad back and a worse reputation. They say he dies from the exertions of trying to keep up with his young bride. You'll leave that to your imagination, so now Mary's a widow, technically free, but the ink on Louis's death certificate isn't even dry before she pulls off the real scandal. While still in France, and under the very nose of the English embassy, she marries Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. He's handsome, bold, charming, and definitely not royalty. The king's best friend, yes, but a commoner in the eyes of dynastic politics. And this is a nightmare for Henry. Not because he didn't know about the romance, he did. He just never expected his sister to skip the whole permission part. You're there in the side chapel when they do it. A rushed ceremony, low candlelight, a priest who looks like he wants to be anywhere else. Mary wears black mourning clothes and defiance in her eyes. Charles barely looks nervous, either because he's too in love or too stupid to be scared of Henry's wrath. Probably both. Back in England, it explodes. Henry is furious, not just for the breach of protocol, but because he'd planned to use Mary in another political marriage. Now she's burned that bridge, and potentially his alliance with France, all for some high-cheekboned duke. You creep into the Privy Council chamber where the king paces, red-faced, practically steam-powered with rage. Advisors suggest annulment, others whisper execution. Henry seriously considers having Charles Brandon beheaded. Yes, his own best friend, for daring to touch Tudor blood without royal consent. But here's the twist. Mary was smart. She'd already written Henry a long manipulative letter full of flattery, appeals to brotherly love, and references to childhood memories. She knew exactly which strings to tug. And Brandon? He throws himself on the king's mercy, grovelling with all the sincerity a desperate man can muster. Somehow, it works. Henry lets them live, though not without punishment. They're fined a staggering sum, basically ransomed for their own survival. You watch them sell off jewellery, land and dignity to pay it off. Despite the rocky start, Mary and Charles have a solid marriage. You see them years later, sitting side by side at a banquet, laughing, stealing bread off each other's plates, behaving less like royalty and more like real people. It's jarring in this world of arranged unions and political chess games. She calls him my sweet Chuck, which sounds ridiculous, and yet somehow endearing in a court where no one says what they really mean. Now here's your odd detail. When Mary was Queen of France, her hair was said to be so long she could sit on it. That fact has almost nothing to do with her love life, but it's one of those small, beautiful details that makes her feel more real. Picture her brushing it out alone, wondering if she'd ever get to choose her own fate, and the scholarly debate. It centres around whether Mary's marriage to Charles Brandon was truly romantic or calculated. Some historians argue she knew exactly what she was doing, orchestrating the whole rebellion under the cover of mourning. She was well aware of Henry's weaknesses and played them perfectly. Others see her as a woman simply fed up with being a pawn, grabbing at the one chance she had for personal happiness before being married off again. Maybe it was both, a sharp mind and a full heart, colliding at just the right moment. Mary dies young, at just 37. Her health had declined steadily, and by the time of her death she'd faded from the centre of court life. You stand near her tomb at St Mary's Church in Bury St Edmunds, where a soft breeze rustles through the stained glass. For a woman who once caused an international scandal, she's remembered quietly. No monument, no grand fanfare, just a name in the shadows of history, carved beneath the words Mary Rose. But her legacy endures, not in bloodlines. Her descendants never ruled, but in defiance. She proved a Tudor could choose love and survive it. Not unscarred, not unchanged, but still alive. As you leave the chapel, you pass a portrait of Henry, glowering as usual. You smile just a little. He played king, Mary played human, and for once the human won. Next up, you're heading east, far east, into the imperial courts of China, where an emperor's obsession with his beloved concubine sparks poetry, rebellion, and one of the bloodiest uprisings in dynastic history. You move quietly now, through corridors that no longer echo with boots or slippers but with the weight of centuries. The halls of the Tang dynasty's imperial palace seem to breathe around you. Red lacquer, gold trim, silk screens painted with cranes and dragons. You're in Chang'an, ancient China's heart, at the height of its golden age, and the scent in the air is sandalwood, chrysanthemum tea, and power laced with fear. The emperor here is Xuanzong, ruler of a vast empire, a poet, a patron of the arts, and, as you're about to witness, a man who fell so hard in love it helped trigger one of the deadliest rebellions in Chinese history. Welcome to a royal affair that literally burned down a dynasty. The woman? Yang Guifei, also known as Yang Yuhuan. Her name means precious consort Yang, and trust me, the name doesn't do her justice. You first see her lounging beneath a cherry blossom tree in the imperial gardens, her hair threaded with pearls, her fingers trailing the surface of a koi pond like she's stirring fate itself. She's already legendary before the affair begins. She'd been married once, ironically to the emperor's own son. But that was inconvenient, so Emperor Xuanzong annulled it, sent the son far away, and claimed her for himself. Problem solved. Sort of. From the moment she enters the palace, everything changes. She doesn't just walk, she glides, perfumed, poised, and always slightly amused. The emperor is besotted. He gifts her palaces, jewels, silken gowns scented with orchid oil. You follow him as he abandons his responsibilities bit by bit, skipping court meetings to write poetry in her presence. Ministers grumble, generals twitch, but Yang Guifei becomes not just his obsession, she becomes his world. She brings her family into the court too, and that's where things really start to unravel. Her cousin, Yang Guozhong, is ambitious and reckless, worming his way into high political office. You see the other ministers eyeing him with murder in their expressions, their fingers twitching near their scrolls as the empire slowly slides from order to indulgence. And still, the emperor won't hear a word against her. You sit beside him as he listens to music she composed, while out in the provinces, whispers of revolt spread like wildfire. Then comes the breaking point, and Lucian, a general once favoured by both the emperor and Yang Guifei herself, launches a massive rebellion in 755. You feel it like a crack across the spine of the empire. Troops desert, provinces fall, the capital is evacuated in chaos. The emperor and his entourage flee on horseback, racing towards Sichuan as the world they ruled burns behind them. You ride along, dust in your mouth, listening to the terrified gasps of palace officials and sobbing concubines. But the soldiers, exhausted, angry, betrayed, blame someone. And they don't blame the emperor, they blame her. At Maui Station they stop the imperial caravan. They demand blood. Not just Yang Guozhong, who's executed on the spot, but her, Yang Guifei. The emperor resists, begs, weeps. You're close enough to hear him say he can't live without her, but his guards are firm. The empire won't be saved unless she dies. She's led away to a nearby temple under armed escort. You follow at a distance, the sun beating down on the silk of her robes. No royal ceremony, no final speech. Just a length of silk and a moment of brutal silence. She's strangled quietly, her body is buried in haste in unmarked earth. The emperor remains behind, broken and stunned. He continues fleeing, but the light has gone out of his eyes. Later, when the rebellion is finally suppressed, years and millions of deaths later, Xuanzong returns to the capital. But nothing is the same. He's no longer emperor in all but name, having abdicated in disgrace. He spends his final years as a shell of the man he once was, writing poems to Yang Guifei, commissioning artists to paint her face from memory. You walk with him through the palace gardens, now overgrown, where the scent of her still seems to linger. Now here's your strange little detail. It's said that Yang Guifei was so beautiful, and her skin so fragrant, that she had to be washed in a special bath of lychee fruits and warm milk daily, imported at absurd expense. Whether that's true or court flattery is anyone's guess, but the idea has stuck for centuries. One woman worth the logistics of an entire fruit supply chain. And the big debate? Some historians argue that Yang Guifei was scapegoated, that the real culprit of the rebellion was political mismanagement long before she entered the scene. Others insist her influence, and her cousin's corrupt role directly led to the empire's near collapse. But whether she was guilty or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is that a love story so grand and so indulgent turned deadly when reality caught up. She's remembered as one of the 4 beauties of ancient China, so beautiful she put flowers to shame. Poems still mourn her, operas still sing her name, and in a secluded garden in Xi'an, a monument now stands over the place where she might have been buried. It's simple, small, easy to miss, like a whisper. You leave the Tang court with your heart heavy. Some loves die in scandal, others in exile, but this one died in transit, carried across mountains only to be buried in silence. No crown, no last embrace. Just history folding in on itself like silk wrapped too tightly around the throat. Next stop, Russia. Bring a coat. You're heading into the snow-laced chambers of Catherine the Great, where whispers of rebellion, lust, and furry hats swirl in the candlelit corners, and her most trusted lover may be plotting something far darker than romance. You arrive in Russia under a sky that never seems to brighten. It's always dusk here, or maybe that's just how the palace feels. Thick walls of granite, chandeliers dripping wax like time itself is melting, and rooms that echo even when no one's speaking. This is the winter court of Catherine the Great, Empress of all the Russias, and you've barely stepped inside before you're slipping on polished marble and secrets. She's not the Ice Queen history likes to paint her as. No, Catherine is fire wrapped in ermine, intellect sharpened by exile, and a woman who has rewritten her entire destiny using nothing but strategy, charm, and very calculated scandal. Tonight, though, you're focused on one particular chapter of her romantic resume, the one that includes Count Grigory Orlov. He's tall, broad-shouldered, military-bred, and smarter than people give him credit for. More importantly, he's loyal. At least for now. You spot them across the ballroom, not dancing, never that, but standing close enough to make the court buzz. Her hand lingers too long on his arm, his eyes never leave her face. It's not just attraction, it's partnership, and it's dangerous. See, Catherine's already tangled up in a web of palace politics. She's not originally Russian, born a minor German princess, and she wasn't supposed to rule. Her husband, Peter III, technically held the throne, but held is generous. He was erratic, unpopular, obsessed with Prussian uniforms and wooden dolls. People whispered that he was unfit to rule, and Catherine, she listened. That's where Orlov comes in. He's not just a lover, he's a co-conspirator. You're with them in candlelit chambers where revolution is whispered between kisses. Grigory brings her intelligence reports, secures the support of key military units, and perhaps most importantly, holds her hand when the coup actually goes down. That's right. Coup. In 1762, Catherine takes the throne with Orloff by her side, and her husband conveniently imprisoned. You're not there when Peter dies under mysterious circumstances, but let's just say the timing is suspicious, and Orloff's name appears in more than one rumour. Afterward, Catherine rewards him handsomely. Titles, land, power, but more than that, affection. You walk through her private apartments and see gifts exchanged between them, lockets with painted eyes, handwritten notes in surprisingly sentimental Russian, and even a pet bear once, because why not? They live openly, scandalously, as lovers. Some even believe they were married in secret, but the Empress is careful. She loves, yes, but she never relinquishes control. Here's where it starts to sour. Orlov, flush with pride and rank, starts acting like a husband. A mistake. He grows possessive, impatient. And Catherine, ever pragmatic, begins to pull away. She doesn't break up with men. She phases them out like winter clothing. You're there when Grigory realizes he's being replaced. Not with a general, but with a young, ambitious officer named Grigory Potemkin. Same first name, entirely different energy. Still, Catherine doesn't banish Orlov immediately. She lets him linger. You see him pacing the halls of the Winter Palace, wondering if he can win her back. He tries. He even presents her with a diamond of staggering size, literally named the Orlov diamond, in a desperate bid to rekindle their closeness. It's a gorgeous gem, icy and perfect. She accepts it. She thanks him. But nothing else changes. Now here's your odd little historical detail. The Orlov diamond was once part of the idol statue of a Hindu temple in South India, stolen and sold through a chaotic series of trades before it ended up in Grigory's hands. So yes, an affair that began as a political alliance ended with a sacred stone from halfway around the world, wrapped in Russian guilt and imperial ambition. History doesn't do subtle, and the debate. Some historians argue Orlov was the true love of Catherine's life, her longest and most politically significant companion. Others say she used him from the start, a stepping stone with muscles. There's even speculation that Orlov played a hand in Peter III's death far beyond what official reports suggest. A lover, yes, but maybe also an executioner. The truth is probably somewhere between those extremes, buried under a snowdrift of letters lost and memories rewritten. You see Orlov's decline happen slowly. He drifts into melancholy, then madness. Later in life he suffers from what we'd now call dementia, but then it was just whispered that he had lost his mind. You visit him in his final days, shivering, vacant, calling out for Catherine as if she might still walk through the door. She doesn't. Still, Catherine remains kind in her way. She cares for him financially. She orders his needs attended to, but the Empress is always forward-facing. By the time Orlov dies in 1783, she's taken other lovers, reshaped Russia, and steered her empire into the Enlightenment. You catch her, once, looking at the diamond. She doesn't smile, doesn't speak, just sets it back in its case and walks away. You step into the snow now, pulling your coat tight. Russia doesn't weep for its fallen lovers. It buries them in silence and marble. Catherine wrote volumes of philosophy, law, and political strategy, but never a love letter that survived. Orlov exists only in fragments now, in portraits, in rumours, in the glint of a stolen gem. But you saw them once in the flicker of candlelight planning a coup between flirtations, and no history book can ever quite recapture what burned there. Next, you're heading back to the east, but this time into a Mughal court at war with itself. A Persian princess, an Indian prince, and a love that crosses not just borders but dynasties. You're back under an opulent sky now, stars scattered across silk-black velvet, the air humming with distant music and the low murmur of intrigue. This time you're not in a cold European palace or a winter-drenched Russian fortress. You're deep in the lush heart of Mughal India again, the 17th century this time, standing in the shadow of a court still echoing with the grandeur of Shah Jahan, the man who built the Taj Mahal. But tonight, your focus isn't on mausoleums or marble domes. It's on a love that bloomed in the margins of dynastic chaos. A Persian princess named Roshanara and a Mughal prince named Dara Shikoh, whose hearts aligned for a moment before being pulled apart by something far more powerful than scandal. War. You're in the Red Fort of Delhi now, moving silently through the cooling corridors as jasmine and rose petals are swept up by the wind. Dara Shikoh is here, the eldest son of Shah Jahan, tall and soft-spoken, a scholar with a warrior's posture and a poet's soul. He's favoured by his father to succeed the throne, a problem naturally, since he has brothers who aren't too keen on stepping aside quietly. But for now, none of that shows. Tonight he's watching Roshanara from across the marble courtyard, where lanterns flicker like trapped fireflies. She is, in every sense, a forbidden figure. Not just because she's his cousin, which, to be fair, wasn't an unusual issue for royal families, but because she's politically entangled. Her loyalty leans toward a different brother, Aurangzeb, the ambitious and ruthlessly devout military commander waiting in the wings. But Roshanara is no one's pawn. You watch her slip past handmaidens with her silk dupatta, trailing like mist, the beads in her hair clicking softly like a clock ticking down to disaster. Her attraction to Dara is visible even in the smallest gestures. He lends her books, translations of the Upanishads he's studying, secret commentaries he's written about unity between Hinduism and Islam. They walk together under moonlight, sometimes just talking, sometimes not. You hear them whispering about philosophy, the soul, the idea that love might transcend religion and empire, and you almost believe it, until reality crashes through like a war elephant on parade. Because while Dara dreams of harmony, Aurangzeb sharpens his sword, and Roshanara, well, this is where it gets murky. Some believe she was in love with Dara, torn between her heart and her political loyalty. Others say she manipulated his trust, feeding information to Aurangzeb the entire time. You're there when the tide turns. The brothers go to war, the empire fracturing under their father's ailing rule. Shah Jahan falls ill, and instead of standing beside Dara, Roshanara disappears from his side, and that absence, it speaks volumes. When Aurangzeb ultimately wins, defeating Dara and imprisoning their father, it's Roshanara who re-emerges in power, walking the halls of the court with a new authority. You see it in her posture, taller now, less adorned, more lethal. She's awarded her own palace, her own income, her own space in a court that rarely grants women anything beyond marriage or exile. But you still catch her, alone sometimes, reading the same texts Dara once shared with her. The soft flicker of regret dances across her face but never lingers. And Dara, you follow him through his downfall, captured, tried, executed by order of his own brother, his body paraded through Delhi as a warning to those who might dream too loudly. But his legacy refuses to die. His writings, his art, his gentle vision of a more pluralistic empire, they survive, even as his name is scrubbed from monuments. You pass by one of his old manuscripts in a dim archive, pages slightly singed from the fires of time. In the margin, there's a line of poetry scribbled in what might be Roshanara's hand, or might not. No one can agree. Here's a quirky little detail. Roshanara built her own tomb and garden before she died, a rare privilege for women at the time. The Roshanara bag still exists in Delhi, though faded, overgrown, forgotten by most. No grand inscriptions, no declarations of romance or regret. Just a woman buried in a garden she designed, as if trying to write her own ending while the world kept writing over it. And here's the open debate. Did Roshanara betray Dara out of ambition? Or did she know he would never survive Aurangzeb's rise and try to spare him a slower fate? Some scholars argue she played a long game to ensure her own safety and power. Others point to her letters, those few that remain, and say no. This was a woman torn apart by divided loyalties and forced to make impossible choices. It's hard to say who she really loved. Maybe even she didn't know. You walk through the Red Fort's remains now, passing crumbling balconies and silent fountains. The empire Roshanara knew is gone, its pieces scattered across time like rose petals on wind. But the story lingers, especially in the quiet places. A Persian princess, a prince who dreamed too much, and a love story that never quite made it out of the shadows. And now you're heading towards Scandinavia, specifically Sweden, where a queen decides she'd rather give up her crown than her freedom. Or possibly a woman. You'll be in a monastery soon, but don't worry, the scandal made it all the way to Rome. The northern winds hit harder as you leave behind Mughal incense and slip into the crisp Protestant chill of 17th century Sweden. Snow crunches beneath your boots as you arrive in Stockholm, where the sky feels too wide and the silence too deep, as though the land itself is waiting for something to break the rules. You're entering the reign of Queen Christina, one of history's most confounding and fascinating monarchs. She's not just a queen, she's a riddle dressed in velvet, a scholar in boots, a woman who shrugged off expectations the way others shed furs at the fire, and tonight, you'll walk with her into one of the strangest royal love stories of all, one where gender, power, and identity all tangle together in the candlelit corners of a monastery. Christina ascends the throne as a child, the only legitimate heir of King Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden's great warrior king who died in battle before she could pronounce the word empire. Raised like a prince rather than a princess, she's educated in philosophy, Latin, theology, fencing, everything but how to behave. By the time she's in her 20s, she's scandalising Stockholm with her disinterest in marriage, her habit of wearing men's clothing, and her fondness for wrestling her courtiers into submission. Sometimes, literally. And then there's Ebba Spara. You spot her first in the Queen's private library, tucked beside a shelf of ancient Roman poetry, her copper hair catching the afternoon sun like fire trapped in a braid. She's not just beautiful, she's intelligent, witty, and charming in a way that Christina clearly can't resist. The two become inseparable. Christina calls her Belle, my beautiful one, and writes her letters that blush the cheeks of modern historians. You read over Christina's shoulder one night, "I embrace you 1,000 times. And I love you more than I can say." It's not subtle. Ebba is technically a lady-in-waiting, but her presence quickly eclipses every other woman at court. You see them walking arm in arm through palace gardens, sharing rooms on royal tours, and exchanging gifts laced with coded devotion. It's clear to anyone with eyes, and certainly to the court, that this isn't just friendship. But the real tension begins when whispers reach beyond Stockholm, all the way to Rome and across Europe's elite circles. A queen refusing to marry is already a problem. A queen possibly in love with another woman? That's a threat. And Christina knows it. That's what makes what happens next so audacious. In 1654, at the height of her reign, she abdicates the throne, just steps down, hands it over to her cousin, packs her books, her wardrobe, her secrets, and leaves. The official reason is exhaustion, philosophical differences, a yearning for Catholicism. But you're there when she kisses Ebba goodbye, and you know there's more beneath that velvet curtain. Christina gives up everything, crown, country, legacy, for freedom. Whether that freedom includes Ebba is less clear. They don't stay together. Ebba marries, perhaps out of pressure, perhaps from heartbreak. Christina moves to Rome, where she causes even more chaos, converting to Catholicism, corresponding with the Pope, and hosting salons so intellectual they make the cardinals sweat. She never marries, never produces an heir, and never stops being deeply, delightfully disruptive. You follow her to a small monastery outside Rome, where she spends her final years surrounded by scholars, artists, and a few suspiciously close female companions. The Vatican tolerates her because she's too interesting to ignore and too dangerous to silence. She's buried with honours usually reserved for men, in a tomb inscribed simply, Christina, Queen of Sweden. No mention of marriage, no children listed, just her name. Here's your strange little detail. Christina was rumoured to have an unusual body for a woman. Anatomists who examined her post-mortem couldn't agree on what they found, fueling centuries of speculation. Intersex, gender non-conforming, merely non-compliant with fashion. No one knows for sure. But her gender expression was so ambiguous that even during her lifetime some people wondered privately if she was assigned the wrong sex at birth, or perhaps never accepted the one given. And that brings us to the central debate. Was Christina and Ebba Spara's relationship romantic in the way we'd understand today? Some scholars say yes, absolutely, citing the passionate letters, the emotional dependency, the lifelong affection. Others argue that Christina's flamboyant affection was just a product of courtly love, exaggerated by loneliness and theatricality. But if you've read her letters, really read them, you know there's love there. Not the performative love of arranged courts or strategic alliances, but real, longing, aching love. And maybe, for Christina, that was the only kind that mattered. You exit the monastery's chapel into the cold Roman night, where the stars are oddly clear above the terracotta rooftops. In the quiet, you can almost hear her voice, sharp, amused, unrepentant. She didn't die a queen, she didn't die a wife, but she died as herself. And now you're heading to modern times, or modern enough. It's the 20th century. You're about to hover behind palace curtains as a young British princess falls in love with a man the crown says she can't have. And for the first time in this journey, the world is watching it all happen on television. You leave the echoes of candlelit monasteries and step directly into the hiss of press cameras and the clicking of high heels on Buckingham Palace tiles. It's the 1950s now, and everything smells like cold cream, cigarette smoke, and political tension wrapped in tweed. You're in post-war Britain, stiff with tradition, but just beginning to feel the tremors of change. And standing at the centre of it all, caught between a centuries-old institution and the flicker of her own heart, is Princess Margaret, younger sister to Queen Elizabeth II, sharp-tongued, impossibly glamorous, and right now, hopelessly in love with a man she's been absolutely forbidden to marry. You're in Clarence's house, watching her laugh at something he just whispered. He's tall, older, tan from years in the Royal Air Force, Group Captain Peter Townsend. The kind of man who would look good in any uniform. He'd been a war hero, a trusted aide to the royal family, and also, unfortunately, a divorcee. That's the issue. Not his character, not his politics. Just that one blot on his marital resume. In 1950s Britain, with the monarchy still dusting itself off from the abdication scandal of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, another royal divorcee love affair is about as welcome as a bomb in the ballroom. But Margaret doesn't care about that. At least, not yet. You see her in her early 20s, bold, vibrant, all red lips and dark waves, with a voice that carries and a laugh that lingers too long in rooms full of stern men. Townsend is her calm centre. Their connection is instant, deep, and completely impossible. You follow them through palace gardens where they pause beneath old oaks, slipping notes into pockets, catching fingertips in the moments between royal duties. Then comes the moment that sets everything in motion. You're there, standing outside the plane on the tarmac in South Africa, when King George VI dies. Elizabeth becomes queen. Margaret becomes even more trapped. With her sister now the sovereign, every move she makes is under the scrutiny of tradition, tabloids, and the Church of England. Marrying a divorcee would require not just public approval, it would require a parliamentary act, and likely the Queen's signature. And the Queen, bound by constitutional duty, no matter her personal feelings. The affair leaks to the press, of course. They always do. Cameras catch the glances, the faint brushing of hands. Margaret's popularity soars. The public loves a rebel princess. But behind palace walls, things are not so romantic. The Queen, young and suddenly burdened with decades of precedent, tries to find a compromise. They send Townsend away, an overseas post in Belgium, a gentleman's exile. You're there when he kisses Margaret goodbye, quickly, out of sight but not out of reach. They write, they wait, for 2 long years. By the time he returns, Margaret is 25, just old enough to marry without royal consent under British law. And yet, you follow her into the drawing room one quiet evening, the letter from Parliament trembling in her hand. If she marries him, she will lose her royal status, her income, her place in the line of succession. She'll be a princess no longer, and Townsend will be a husband without a title. They could run away together. People fantasize about that even now, but this is real life. And she hesitates. Then comes the broadcast. You watch her, standing before a camera, hair perfectly coiffed, voice steady, declaring that she will not marry Peter Townsend. "I've decided not to marry," she says, mindful of the church's teachings, and you feel the crack ripple down her spine. It's not duty. Not really. It's the unbearable pressure of being part of something older than love. She doesn't cry, she doesn't falter. But you know the ache doesn't leave. Peter marries someone else. Margaret does too, eventually. You watch her wedding with a strange kind of hollowness. It's televised, glittering, and entirely performative. She marries photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, handsome, artsy, unpredictable. Their marriage is passionate, volatile, and collapses over time like wet plaster. She drinks more, smokes constantly. The tabloids turn on her. But the love she lost never really stops haunting the background. Here's a quirky little fact. Peter Townsend kept every letter Margaret ever wrote him. stored in a trunk he never let anyone else touch. And Margaret? She kept a portrait of him on her desk for decades, long after they'd gone their separate ways. The kind of souvenirs that don't appear in public, but sit silently behind closed doors. And here's the historian's debate. Did Margaret truly choose duty, or was she coerced, worn down by years of delay and public scrutiny? Some argue she could have walked away and been fine, that her sacrifice was more about fear than loyalty. Others believe she genuinely believed in the crown in her role, and couldn't bear to be the second Windsor to cause a constitutional crisis. The truth likely lies in the grey space between obligation and exhaustion. You see her later in life, slightly stooped, still fiercely fashionable, still smoking with a kind of elegance that makes you want to light up out of sheer peer pressure. She never publicly discussed Townsend again, but you see it in her eyes during interviews, the flicker that says, "I remember." She dies in 2002. Townsend had died a few years before her. No reunion, no final phone call, just history folding quietly in on itself, like a love letter placed back in the drawer. You step out of the palace into the soft rain of London, your reflection warping in the slick stones of the courtyard. The modern world was supposed to allow different endings, but sometimes royalty still runs by rules that make love a luxury instead of a right. Next, we dive straight back into Renaissance scandal. You're headed into the Vatican itself, yes, that Vatican, where a pope's daughter weaves her way through poison, politics, and maybe more than one illicit affair. Her name is Lucrezia, and trust me, you're going to want to stay quiet for this one. You lower your head and slip through the walls of the most fortified city-state in Europe, the Vatican. It's the late 1400s, and everything here is laced with incense, murmured Latin, and bloodless ambition dressed up in silk and sacred robes. The air is thick, not just with holiness, but with something darker, something coppery and cloying, as if the marble remembers every secret carved into it. At the centre of it all sits Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI. But you're not here for him, not really. You're here for his daughter, Lucrezia, golden-haired, sharp-eyed, and destined to be both legend and cautionary tale. She's 17 when you first see her, standing at the edge of a Vatican corridor with light pouring in from a high, stained glass window. She's dressed in ivory, her hair caught up in braids threaded with pearls, and her gaze is fixed on a cardinal who's pretending not to look terrified of her. Because here's the thing, Lucrezia isn't just the Pope's daughter, she's his favourite, his secret weapon, and maybe, depending on who you ask, his lover. Yes, that rumour. It's everywhere, and it's loud. You hear it in the whispers that slither through Rome's courts and alleys, that Pope Alexander is not just a corrupt spiritual leader, but an actual father in more ways than one. That his daughter was never just a pawn, but a player in a family so twisted the Medici took notes. There's no proof, of course, just letters that lean a little too tender and a court portrait where her father's hand rests just a little too low on her shoulder. You watch her move through the Vatican like a queen, not a daughter, and you wonder if maybe, just maybe, the truth was more complicated than any scandal can explain. Her first marriage is political, of course. To Giovanni Sforza, a nobleman from a powerful Milanese family, the alliance is useful until it isn't. When the Borgias decide he's no longer advantageous, they try to dissolve the marriage by claiming it was never consummated, which is awkward, considering they'd already had a wedding night and a few years of uncomfortable cohabitation. You sit in the back of the court as Giovanni's face turns every shade of insulted, then humiliated, then vindictive. He doesn't go quietly. Instead, he retaliates by fueling the incest rumours, calling Lucrezia her father's mistress and her brother Cesare's too. Ah, Cesare Borgia. You've probably heard of him. Lucrezia's other shadow. Her brother, her bodyguard, her rumoured lover, her co-conspirator. You see him watching her from across the garden with the same intense devotion he shows to his sword. They are close, dangerously close. They speak their own language, finish each other's thoughts, and when Lucrezia's annulment is finalised, it's Cesare who arranges her next marriage. You start to suspect that Lucrezia's heart isn't really allowed to choose anything. Her second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, begins with real hope. They're young, he's handsome. For once, Lucrezia looks genuinely content, even radiant. You see her laugh with him in the Vatican's courtyard garden, a moment of rare sunlight in a life lived under candle flame and suspicion. But Cesare doesn't approve. Alfonso has political ties that threaten the Borgia's expanding influence. So one night Alfonso is attacked, stabbed on the steps of St. Peter's by masked men. He survives. For a while. You watch Cesare visit him during his recovery, smiling cold. Then one morning, Alfonso is found dead, strangled in bed with Lucrezia just one room away. You don't see her scream, but the silence afterward is louder than any wail. By now, Lucrezia's name is synonymous with danger. Poison rings, lovers vanished, scandals whispered in a dozen languages, and yet, here's the twist. She's also deeply religious. You find her weeping in confession one morning, her hands clenched so tight around her rosary that her knuckles turn white. Her letters, those that survive, reveal guilt, melancholy, even longing for a normal life she'll never have. She's part victim, part villain, always somewhere in between. Her final marriage, to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, pulls her away from Rome's chaos. She becomes a duchess. She hosts salons. She raises children, builds hospitals, funds churches. You walk the halls of her Ferrara court and see a different woman, a quieter power, but power nonetheless. And yet, even here, the past clings to her like perfume on old silk. No matter how charitable, how graceful, how devout she becomes, she's still a Borgia. And the world will always remember what they think she did, not what she actually did. Here's your strange detail. Lucrezia had her own private room in the Vatican with a peephole built into the floor, allowing her to observe the papal court below. Maybe it was for entertainment. Maybe it was for intelligence. Maybe, just maybe, it was the only place she could watch the world without being seen in return. And the scholarly debate? It centres around whether Lucrezia was an innocent pawn, manipulated by her father and brother for political gain, or whether she was an active player, complicit in the poisonings, the betrayals, the executions. Some historians insist she was just a girl trapped in a cruel game. Others argue she mastered the game and played it better than anyone else. You leave her tomb in Ferrara with mixed feelings. There's no judgment here, just layers. Lucrezia Borgia was not a saint, but she wasn't the devil either. She was something else entirely, a mirror maybe, reflecting the filth and glory of the Renaissance world that shaped her. And now you're going to Prussia. It's quieter there, stiffer. But don't let the porcelain skin and noble composure fool you. Queen Louise's friendship with a certain French conqueror might have been something a lot deeper, or a lot more dangerous. You step into Prussia just as winter begins to crack the edges of its stiff military frame. Everything here is precise. Snow falls in neat lines, boots march in perfect rhythm, and royal protocol feels less like a suggestion and more like a physical weight pressing down on your chest. Berlin is quiet, almost frozen, its palaces symmetrical and polite, but you can feel a disturbance just under the surface. Because tonight, behind layers of satin and diplomacy, a queen is about to meet a conqueror. And though history insists it was all above board, you can't help noticing the look in her eyes when she says his name. Napoleon! This is Queen Louise of Prussia, Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, if you want to get formal about it. And despite her conservative legacy, she's anything but boring. You see her now, sweeping through Charlottenburg Palace like a snowstorm in a silk gown. She's tall, striking, luminous, in a way that makes people pause mid-sentence when she walks into a room. Married to King Frederick William III, who is, well, let's say devoted, but not exactly thrilling. Louise brings the fire to this royal equation. She's adored by her people, cherished for her grace and courage, especially as Prussia faces its darkest hour. And that's the moment you've walked into. It's 1806, and everything is falling apart. Napoleon has crushed the Prussian army at the Battle of Jena Auerstedt, and now the French emperor is marching across Europe like he owns the place, which, increasingly, he kind of does. Prussia is on its knees, Berlin is occupied, and Louise, instead of hiding, steps forward. You follow her to Tilsit, a sleepy riverside town where she agrees to meet Napoleon face to face, one queen to emperor, in a private diplomatic meeting. But no one really believes she's just here to talk politics. She arrives at the treaty tent in full regalia, looking like a portrait come to life, every pleat in her gown perfect, her expression composed but unflinching. You linger just outside as Napoleon, famously dismissive of most royals, actually rises when she enters. That alone tells you everything. The conversation is quiet, too quiet for the scribes to record more than the basics, but you see it, the spark. Not quite flirtation, not quite rivalry, something more dangerous, admiration. Napoleon later calls her the only real man in Berlin, which, depending on your perspective, is either a backhanded compliment or the highest praise he could offer. Louise, in turn, reportedly charms him in a way no other monarch ever did. She doesn't give ground, she doesn't beg, she makes her case with elegance and fire, and he listens. Now, the rumours start immediately, the French court gossips, the Prussian ministers raise eyebrows. What really happened in that tent? Some say she tried to seduce him for a better treaty. Others believe he was genuinely smitten. You never see them touch, but the way they look at each other speaks volumes. Napoleon ends up granting better terms than anyone expected. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe he just couldn't say no to her. Still, the political fallout is brutal. Prussia loses half its territory. The humiliation is enormous. But Louise? She emerges from it almost mythologized. You're there when she returns to Berlin, greeted not as a queen, but as a kind of saint in a corset, martyr to diplomacy, protector of her people, and possibly, maybe, the one who briefly held Napoleon's attention like a flame in the wind. Here's your strange little detail. After their meeting, Napoleon allegedly kept a portrait miniature of Louise among his private effects. That might be apocryphal, no one ever found it for sure, but it's exactly the kind of poetic rumour that sticks to these stories like honey. And if it was true, it wouldn't be the strangest trophy he ever carried. And here's the historian's dilemma. Was this relationship, if you can even call it that, romantic, strategic, or simply symbolic? Some believe Napoleon saw in Louise a rare equal, someone who challenged him intellectually and emotionally. Others think the whole story has been blown out of proportion, a fantasy fueled by 19th century romanticism and nationalist myth-making. And still others insist that Louise used her beauty and composure deliberately, knowing that if she couldn't win on the battlefield, she might win in the drawing room. Louise dies young, just 34, only a few years after the Tilsit meeting. Some say it was stress, others say tuberculosis. Either way, you're in her room as the final candle burns low. Her husband weeps at her side, his grief genuine, his love for her one of the few uncomplicated things in this story. After her death, he builds a mausoleum for her, commissioned statues, and never really recovers. Prussia itself eventually rises again, fueled in part by the legend of its lost queen. You walk through her tomb at Charlottenburg now, where the air is always cold and still. People leave flowers, they whisper. No one quite says it, but the ghost of that meeting with Napoleon hangs there like an unanswered question. Did they simply talk? Or did something more dangerous pass between them? Something that reshaped the fates of nations with nothing more than a look? And now, you're heading back to Britain, but this time to a royal scandal that began not with a queen or princess, but with a certain ambitious woman named Wallis Simpson, and the prince who risked the entire monarchy just to be with her. You step back into Britain, but the fog is a little greyer now, the buildings taller and more impatient. The year is 1936, and the world is in flux. Jazz is on the radio, fascism is rising, and Buckingham Palace is doing its very best to pretend none of it affects them. But behind the iron gates and stiff collars, there's a royal scandal brewing so loud it will rattle the crown off an empire. You're here for Edward VIII, not yet the Duke of Windsor, and a woman named Wallis Simpson, whose very presence is enough to send shockwaves through the throne. But your focus tonight isn't just the king who abdicated for love, it's the lesser-known angle, the brother, the other prince, Prince George, Duke of Kent. And the question that's been quietly following him, did he fall for Wallis Simpson first? You find George at a party in Mayfair, drink in one hand, cigarette in the other, always smiling, always just a little too charming for someone with royal blood. He's the fourth son of King George V, which means he has rank but not responsibility, a dangerous combination. He's sleek, magnetic, and, if we're being honest, the most bohemian Windsor of the lot. Artists love him, so do actresses, and, apparently so did Wallis. She enters the party like a wasp in a drawing room, thin, sharp, impossible to ignore. Not traditionally beautiful, but radiating something harder to define. Confidence, maybe, or the quiet thrill of danger. You watch George approach her like a moth to a flame, his polished charm colliding with her American bite. Their conversations crackle. No royal formality, no hesitations. Just banter, veiled glances, and a current that makes everyone in the room start watching. Was there an affair? Some say yes, brief, before Edward stepped in. Others say it was emotional, a flirtation that never quite tipped into scandal. But George wasn't exactly known for self-restraint. You trail him through jazz clubs and artist lofts, catching glimpses of a man who moved between worlds, who wanted freedom more than protocol. And Wallis? She was the perfect mirror. Both of them used to skating just close enough to the edge without quite falling off, but Edward sees her too. And once he does, the triangle collapses. You feel the energy shift, the way George steps back, how the conversations between him and Wallis lose their heat, like a fire dampened before it could roar. Edward is possessive, passionate, willing to risk everything. And George, well, George always knew how this worked. He may have wanted her, may have even had her first, but when a future king makes a choice, everyone else falls in line or disappears. What follows is the story you already know, but watching it unfold firsthand is something else entirely. You're there when Edward, now king, refuses to give up Wallis, despite every advisor, bishop and parliamentarian begging him to reconsider. Wallis is still married at first, to a wealthy American businessman who's increasingly left alone at parties. The press calls her a friend, the palace calls her a problem. You watch her being tailed by private investigators, her phone tapped, her mail opened. They say she's a gold digger, a social climber. Some go further, whispering she's a Nazi sympathizer, a spy, even a dominatrix. None of it matters to Edward. In December 1936, he abdicates, just walks away, becomes the Duke of Windsor, marries Wallis in a private ceremony in France, without a single member of the royal family in attendance, not even George. And the crown, it passes to Albert, now King George III, who never wanted it. You can practically hear the shift in the royal family's breathing, like they've been holding it for a year and are only now realising it's going to be permanent. But back to George. While his brother becomes a footnote in romantic tragedy, George becomes a quieter mystery. His own romantic life remains fluid, complicated. There are rumours of affairs with women and men, of deep friendships that border on obsessive, of disappearances into Paris and Berlin under fake names. You follow him through shadowy corridors and wartime parties, where every interaction feels like a secret. He marries Princess Marina of Greece, and they look picture perfect in photographs. But behind the scenes, the intimacy is questionable. There's distance, smoke between them. Here's your strange little fact. George was once arrested in France for being out past curfew during the war, dressed incognito and carrying nothing but a flask and a book of poetry. No ID, no entourage, just George, wandering. And somehow, that says more than anything else. And the debate that lingers, was George's connection to Wallis a genuine love affair, a passing infatuation, or something more politically explosive? Some believe his interest in her was the spark that first caught Edward's attention, a competitive flicker between brothers. Others think it was George who introduced them in the first place, not realising what he was about to set in motion. There's even a theory, whispered in the more shadowy corners of Windsor history, that George resented Edward deeply, not for loving Wallis, but for choosing her so completely and publicly when he himself could not. George's life ends suddenly, in 1942. A military plane crashed in Scotland, under mysterious circumstances. He was on a mission no one quite understood, in weather that should have grounded the flight. Conspiracies blossom. Was it sabotage, a cover-up, or just another Windsor tragedy swallowed by fog? You stand in the wreckage, still charred decades later, and the silence doesn't answer. Wallis lives long after, outlives Edward, outlives the scandal, outlives nearly everyone who cursed her name. She dies in Paris in 1986, silent and alone, surrounded by furniture and photographs of a man who gave up the world for her. George is buried with far less attention, his story largely tucked away beneath layers of royal distraction. But now, as you walk through the palace halls that still whisper their names, you know the truth is far messier than any official story. A prince who might have loved her first, a king who refused to let her go, and a woman who never said exactly what she felt. Not once, not to anyone. Next, you're heading south to Renaissance Italy again, to Milan, where the widow of a murdered duke falls for his enemy, and you'll be the one listening behind the frescoed wall as everything unravels. The Renaissance doesn't ease you in, it throws you directly into the velvet-draped chaos of Milan, where every smile hides a blade and every family crest is soaked in somebody's blood. It's the late 1400s, and the Sforza dynasty rules the city like a lion wearing pearls, brutal but beautiful. You walk through Castello Sforzesco, its towers looming over the city like sentinels, and step into a palace dripping with ambition, silk and unfinished frescoes. Milan is a city of masks, and tonight, the most carefully worn of all belongs to a woman named Beatrice d'Este, Duchess, widow and, perhaps most dangerously, a woman in love with the wrong man. She's barely out of girlhood when she marries Ludovico Sforza, Il Moro, the Duke of Milan, and one of the most powerful figures in Italy. He's twice her age, politically ruthless, and exactly the kind of man Beatrice knows how to handle. At first, it's a strategic match, but you're there on the day of their wedding, watching Beatrice step out of her carriage with her back straighter than any brides you've seen so far. She wears jewels like armour and smiles with just enough mischief to make the old men at court uncomfortable. Their marriage turns out to be oddly functional. She charms the Milanese court, dances with artists and envoys, hosts literary salons in 3 languages. Ludovico falls for her in spite of himself. And yet, it's not his affection that ignites history. It's what happens after his assassination. Because once Ludovico's gone, Beatrice finds herself not only grieving, but confronted by someone she was never meant to love. The man accused of betraying and ultimately orchestrating Ludovico's fall, Gian Galeazzo Sanseverino. He's younger, handsomer, bolder. You see it the moment their eyes meet across the cloister garden during a political gathering. Her grief pressed into the folds of black silk, his guilt slung around his shoulders like a knight's cloak. The chemistry is immediate and deeply inconvenient. Gian Galeazzo had been Ludovico's military commander, once trusted like a brother. But when the French invade and everything collapses, Gian sides with the invaders. For Beatrice, this man represents everything she should hate. But she doesn't. Their meetings are subtle. You crouch behind a drape in the ducal library as they speak in low tones, careful to use too many words rather than too few. They discuss philosophy, war, morality, and, very quietly, regret. Beatrice keeps her mourning veil up for months longer than protocol demands, but her glances start to linger. You watch her hands tremble as he kisses her fingers during a formal greeting. She blinks too slowly. He speaks too softly. They never marry. They never even openly acknowledge their affection. But it's there, pulsing between every formal exchange, every carefully coordinated court appearance. Milan is too dangerous for obvious romance, especially when your dead husband was one of the most cunning politicians in Europe. But Gian Galeazzo doesn't distance himself. He returns to Milan often, too often. You see the court's reaction, suspicion first, then scandal, then something like fear. Because if this love became public, it wouldn't just be a shameful affair. It could realign political alliances, enrage rival noble families, and destroy what little stability the city still has left. Beatrice knows this. So does he. But they keep meeting, secretly, boldly. In the corners of cathedrals, in the gardens behind the Brera Monastery, once even in a hidden chamber in Leonardo da Vinci's workshop. You see them touch finally once fleetingly, his hand to her face, as she closes her eyes and says nothing. Here's your quirky detail. Beatrice was obsessed with the idea of courtly love, and once commissioned a poet to write a series of allegorical verses about a knight betrayed by his duty and rescued by the ghost of a queen. The identity of the knight was never confirmed, but those close to her knew who it was supposed to be. The ghost? Probably her, always present but never fully alive when it came to love. And here's the academic fight that's still going on today. Did Beatrice and Gian Galeazzo truly love each other? Or was their closeness another political performance, a complicated act of survival disguised as longing? Some argue that she used her proximity to him as leverage against French influence in Milan. Others swear that a series of private letters, now lost of course, proved a deep and enduring connection between them, one she never allowed herself to fully pursue. As with so many women in power, it's unclear how much of her heart was hers to give. Beatrice dies young, just 21, possibly from complications during childbirth. You're there in the chapel as the court dons mourning again, this time with a different weight. Gian Galeazzo doesn't attend the funeral publicly, but you see him standing in the shadows just outside the cathedral, bareheaded, rain falling on his cloak, watching the coffin pass with eyes that don't blink. He leaves Milan the next day, quietly, forever. Her tomb remains in Milan, but not the centre of it, not where tourists go. You find it tucked behind an altar, covered in ivy, her effigy staring upward as though still waiting for something unfinished. She ruled with poise, died too soon, and left behind a story written mostly in rumour and silence. You leave the frescoed halls behind, their stories buried under centuries of plaster and politeness, and now you're heading toward Vienna, where gaslights flicker and corsets tighten, and an empress named Elizabeth is about to break every rule with a woman who stole her breath on stage. Vienna glows like a snow globe filled with candlelight and imperial expectation. The streets smell of roasting chestnuts, damp cobblestones, and the distinct perfume of a city that knows it's watching itself. You arrive in the late 19th century, just as the Habsburg Empire starts to crack beneath the weight of modernity, and somewhere behind the royal balconies and gilded mirrors, a scandal is quietly blooming. You're stepping into the private world of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi to those who loved her, though she didn't let many get that close. She's famous for her waist, her hair, and her distance. But tonight, you'll see the woman behind the legend, the restless soul who may have given her heart, perhaps fully, to an actress named Katharina Schratt. The imperial palace is hushed, almost museum-like. As you move through, Sisi isn't there, of course. She's never really there. You'll find her instead in the Alps, on horseback, galloping through the fog like someone trying to outrun her own reflection. Or in Hungary, hunting. Or on a ship to the Ionian Islands, always in motion. But when she's in Vienna, you can find her slipping away from state dinners to sit in the velvet-draped corners of the Burg Theatre, where Katharina takes the stage. Katharina Schratt is magnetic, even when she's still. Not classically beautiful, but powerful in her presence, self-assured, warm and able to command a room with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. You're there the first time Sisi sees her perform. The Empress doesn't clap, doesn't even blink. She simply watches with the quiet intensity of someone recognizing a missing piece. They meet backstage afterward, introduced by courtiers, polite, formal, and then not. You watch their relationship unfold in letters and long walks through palace gardens, guarded by handmaids who look the other way. There's a gentleness between them that Sisi never shared with her husband, Emperor Franz Joseph, who by this point had given up trying to understand his famously elusive wife. But here, with Katharina, Sisi doesn't have to explain herself. She can laugh, she can confide, she can breathe. The Empress begins to spend increasing time at the Schratt Villa, a small home nestled away from the court's view. You walk the halls with her, where she leaves notes, poems, sometimes nothing more than a flower pressed into the spine of a book. Katharina responds in kind, always careful, always coded, nothing overt, just enough to build a fortress of intimacy that the court doesn't quite know what to do with. Here's where it gets messy. Franz Joseph knows about Katharina. In fact, he begins supporting her financially, giving her titles and property. The official narrative says she was his companion, not Sisi's, a convenient fiction. A shield. But you see through it. You watch the way Sisi touches her elbow during quiet conversations, the way Katharina looks for Sisi in a crowded room before anyone else. This wasn't a triangle. This was two women orbiting each other under a chandelier of royal expectations, and a man who chose to stand back. By now, Sisi's mental state is fragile. She's spent decades in a court that worships appearance and loathes emotion. Her children have either died, disappointed her, or been taken from her. She starves herself, walks for miles each day, refuses portraits after age 30. The only constant in her life becomes Katharina, and while they may never say the word, love, you see it everywhere. Here's a curious detail. Sisi often travelled with a small, leather-bound notebook filled with poems about unspoken affection. Several lines are clearly addressed to a woman. She never named her, but one of the poems ends with, "You are the one I chose in silence, and therefore you remain." That notebook was found among her belongings after her death, tucked between a page about Katharina's birthday and a pressed violet. And here's the scholarly divide. Was this a romantic relationship in the modern sense? Some biographers insist it was merely a deep friendship, exaggerated by modern readers hungry for scandal. Others argue that, in a world where queens couldn't say the truth aloud, Sisi and Katharina did everything but carve it into the palace walls. There's no definitive love letter, no photograph of them kissing. But the absence of proof isn't proof of absence, it's proof of discretion. When Sisi is assassinated in 1898, stabbed in the chest by an anarchist in Geneva, you're there in the aftermath. Katharina doesn't speak to the press, doesn't attend the funeral, but she wears black for the rest of her life. The court says it's out of loyalty to the emperor, but those who knew her understood better. You visit her villa decades later. The parlour is untouched, as if Sisi might walk in at any moment. Her chair is still there. Her books still line the shelf. There's even a teacup, unwashed, behind a pane of glass. Katharina lived a long life after the empress died, but never remarried, never re-entered society. She simply waited and remembered. Vienna today still remembers Sisi as the tragic beauty, the reluctant empress who shunned everything but mirrors and melancholia. But you know now that her story wasn't just one of flight and grief. It was also about connection, brief, quiet, forbidden, and fiercely defended. A love that might never be named, but one that clearly never died. And now you're leaving Europe entirely. The air grows hotter, the terrain rougher. You're heading to Africa, into the Zulu kingdom, where a powerful king defies tribal tradition for a woman no one expected, and where love and leadership begin to clash. Africa greets you not with velvet or marble, but with rhythm, drums in the distance, wind in the tall grass, and the scent of smoke, sweat, and blooming fever trees. You're in the Zulu kingdom now, sometime in the late 1800s, where the sky stretches wide and the politics run deep. The British Empire is closing in like a tightening belt, and the Zulu nation stands proud, formidable, and on the edge of war. At the heart of it is King Cetshwayo Kampande, tall, commanding, with eyes like dark iron and the weight of generations sitting heavy on his shoulders. He's meant to lead, to fight, to hold his people together. But what no one expects, what no one allows, is for him to fall in love. The court is not made of bricks or stone, but of huts and song and silence that means more than most speeches. The king walks among his warriors, stoic, watchful, every movement calculated. He's already navigated 1,000 betrayals, internal rivalries, and the slow, creeping encroachment of colonial whispers. But when he meets her, just her, no title, no standing that matches his, everything changes. She's from a lesser clan, barely of note in the Grand Zulu hierarchy. Her name is whispered, not recorded, lost to history like so many women who dared to disrupt male legend. But you see her clearly, strong, laughing with teeth bared and eyes defiant. Not delicate, not courtly, and that's exactly why he can't look away. You catch them talking beside the royal kraal one night, the fire casting flickering shadows as her hands move with passion, her voice low and steady. He listens, really listens, and in a world where kings are supposed to command, listening is the greatest act of intimacy. They meet in secret, not because the kingdom would punish love, but because who she is makes it dangerous. Zulu kings aren't supposed to have favourites, at least not among the women who aren't born into alliance-worthy bloodlines. Royal wives are chosen by counsel, tradition, strategy, not by heart, not by desire. But Cetshwayo, a king already strained by politics and foreign threat, begins to bend the rules. You watch it unfold over months. He gives her bracelets, not just jewellery, but pieces of the royal forge. He allows her to sit near the fires where only wives and councilwomen are allowed. When she's sick, he visits her. When she laughs, his face changes in ways his generals have never seen. And eventually word spreads. The royal Ezekielu, his high advisors, take notice. You're there when one of them warns him, gently but firmly. that elevating her risks, destabilizing the already fragile court. The other wives notice too. They whisper, organize, push back. Not out of jealousy necessarily, but out of fear that affection could rewrite tradition. You see her moved from the royal homestead to a remote dwelling under the guise of protecting her. But really it's exile dressed in protocol. Cetshwayo doesn't stop seeing her. In fact, he begins to challenge the court directly. He proposes giving her a formal title. He introduces her at council meetings, not as a political advisor, but as someone whose presence he wants respected. It doesn't go well. The backlash is swift. His brothers stir unrest. Rumours fly that the king is weak, that he's distracted, that he's being led. And then comes war. The Anglo-Zulu War breaks like a storm, and you watch Cetshwayo retreat into the role he was born for. General, tactician, national symbol. He puts on his war cloak, leads his impis into the bloody terrain of Isandlwana, where Zulu warriors shock the British with one of the most devastating defeats in colonial military history. You stand beside him in the aftermath, breathless, the earth slick with red mud and glory. But even then, as victory roars around him, his eyes search the crowd, for her. But war doesn't stop. It never does when empires are involved. The British regroup. They adapt. They return with more firepower, more ruthlessness. Cetshwayo is eventually captured, his kingdom dismantled by bureaucracy and bayonet. You see him in exile at Cape Town, then in London of all places, paraded before curious crowds in feathered regalia, reduced from king to curiosity. He speaks politely, he negotiates, he charms. But when asked about his wives, about love, he always deflects. You know why? Because she's not there. She wasn't allowed to follow him. The British refused. The court refused. She disappeared into history. No monument, no name, no diary tucked away for scholars to find. Here's your fringe detail. Cetshwayo, during his exile in London, became something of a celebrity. He met Queen Victoria. He went to the opera. He had his photograph taken in formal Western dress, awkwardly tailored and stiff. But in one lesser-known portrait hidden away in a private collection, he wears a bracelet known to have come from that woman's clan. It's a tiny, silent act of memory, of resistance, and the debate? Some historians deny she even existed, arguing that there's no record, no proof. Others cite oral histories passed down in secret that speak of a woman of flame who turned the king's gaze away from war, if only for a moment. Whether she was real, symbolic, or some mixture of the two, depends entirely on who you ask and what you choose to believe. Cetshwayo returns to Zulu land eventually, but never with full power. He dies in 1884, officially of a heart attack. You stand by his grave as the wind picks up, scattering dust and ash across the hills. No one speaks her name, but you know she's there, in the silence, in the space beside him that never quite filled. You leave the savannah now, the sound of distant drums fading behind you. Next, you're stepping into the tightly folded world of Japan, where an American commoner crashes into the world's most insulated royal family, and love begins to tremble beneath 1,000 years of unbroken tradition. The hush of Japan wraps around you like a silk screen, delicate, pristine, and hiding more than it reveals. You step into Tokyo in the 1950s, where everything is ordered, respectful, and controlled to the point of perfection. Even the air feels carefully composed, like the city is constantly pausing mid-breath, waiting to be told what it can feel. Here, the chrysanthemum throne has stood for over 1,000 years, its traditions untouched by time, untouched by scandal, untouched by, well, pretty much everything. And then she walks in, not a noblewoman, not a princess, an American-educated Catholic commoner named Michiko Shoda, and the man she's about to change forever, Crown Prince Akihito. You find him seated in a formal garden, posture impeccable, eyes steady, the son of Emperor Hirohito, yes, that Emperor Hirohito. Akihito was born into a world of post-war reconstruction and delicate imperial reform, a world where his every move was choreographed by centuries of unbroken tradition. He's not supposed to have preferences, or opinions, or heaven forbid, romantic inclinations. But here he is, watching Michiko across a tennis court, her laugh ringing out like wind chimes on a quiet afternoon. and you can already feel the wall beginning to crack. They meet at a Karawizawa tennis match in 1957, in what the press would later describe as a chance encounter. But nothing about their story feels accidental. You're there as Michiko bends to tie her shoe, racket resting on her hip, and Akihito smiles, really smiles, for the first time in months. Their connection is instant, though not immediately public. You watch them navigate the beginning of their courtship through tightly scripted meetings and indirect letters, and you see what it costs them. Because this isn't just a love story, it's a political firestorm wrapped in a kimono. Michiko's a commoner, not descended from the old court nobility, not educated in the shrines of imperial etiquette. She's Catholic too, which in a country where Shinto still clings tightly to the imperial identity is practically an international incident. Worse still, she's educated abroad, independent, self-possessed, everything the imperial household agency has been trained to keep far away from the bloodline. And yet, Akihito insists, he won't marry anyone else. You sit in on tense family meetings where Hirohito says little, but the advisors say everything. They cite tradition, harmony, face, public perception. They do not mention love, because love here is not a requirement for imperial marriage, it's a liability. But Akihito is quietly unmovable. He doesn't shout, doesn't argue, he just waits. And eventually, miraculously, the court relents. You witness the moment in 1959 when Michiko becomes the first commoner in Japanese history to marry into the imperial family. The wedding is broadcast across the country, the first imperial ceremony shown on live television. Millions watch as she bows to him, as he bows back. They are stoic, controlled, but you see it, the heat beneath the formality. The revolution disguised as ritual, and then the backlash. The imperial household agency treats Michiko with icy precision, assigning her handlers, restricting her voice, monitoring her every move. You follow her through palace corridors, her footsteps soft but deliberate, a woman who stepped into a role that wasn't made for her. She's expected to smile, bear airs, say nothing, and vanish behind tradition. Instead, she speaks. Not often, but enough. She supports modern education, writes essays, and quietly, consistently modernizes her image. A mother who takes her children to school by hand, a wife who's seen in public not 3 steps behind, but side by side with her husband. Subtle rebellions, but rebellions all the same. The pressure is relentless. You're there in the mid-1960s when the media turns against her. Stories leak about tension within the palace, about her supposed unsuitability. The stress is so immense that she briefly loses her voice, literally. Psychosomatic aphonia, the doctors say. A voice stolen by pressure. Still, she never leaves. She never breaks. Here's your odd, poignant detail. Michiko wore Western-style dresses to many official events, rather than traditional kimono, drawing criticism from purists but quietly sending a message to the people. This monarchy is changing, with me or without me. And the ongoing scholarly debate, whether Michiko's presence marked the beginning of true imperial reform or merely the illusion of it. Some say she was a symbol, not a driver, that the real modernization came decades later. Others insist her personal courage, especially in staying through the worst of the scrutiny, shifted the tone of the monarchy forever. There's also debate over how much freedom Akihito really had in choosing her, or whether his insistence was backed by subtle power moves behind the throne. Whatever the truth, their bond never faded. When Akihito eventually abdicated in 2019, the first emperor in over 2 centuries to do so, he did it with Michiko beside him, hand in hand, white-haired, still smiling that same soft smile from the tennis courts of Karuizawa. Their son Naruhito now reigns, with a wife of his own who has faced similar pressures. The cycle continues, but a little less rigidly, thanks to a marriage that once felt like a national crisis. You walk through the serene gardens of the Imperial Palace today, hearing only the distant splash of koi and the crunch of gravel underfoot. No portraits of rebellion hang here, no plaques, but the echoes remain. A prince who chose love, a woman who chose to stay, and a monarchy that bent just slightly because of both. Now you're heading back into the dying light of Imperial Russia. The court of the Romanovs is about to fall, but not before one Grand Duke makes a daring escape into Parisian arms, and maybe helps bring down the empire along the way. The final days of Imperial Russia are gilded in frost and gunpowder, and you step into it like someone falling through a Fabergé egg. Beautiful, delicate, and bound to shatter. St. Petersburg, 1916. The city hums with paranoia beneath its icy elegance. Palaces still glitter, balls are still held, but everyone knows the end is near. The streets are filled with hungry workers, and behind the palace walls, the Romanovs are living like people frozen in a portrait, too stiff to move. Too afraid to acknowledge the cracks, you're here for Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich Romanov, cousin to Tsar Nicholas II, Olympic athlete, eligible bachelor, and a man who somehow finds himself wrapped in two different love affairs that defy the rules of royalty, revolution, and, well, fashion. He's tall, striking, his Romanov cheekbones doing their usual damage, but there's something haunted in his eyes. You see it when he removes his gloves at the Winter Palace, fingertips trembling slightly, as if the cold isn't entirely from the weather. Dmitri is in his 20s, privileged to the point of suffocation, and yet restless. He rides horses like he's trying to outrun a prophecy, and lately he's been drawn into dangerous conversations with even more dangerous people, most notably Felix Yusupov. And yes, that means Rasputin is around the corner. But before you get to the blood-soaked part of this story, there's another figure waiting in the wings, Coco Chanel. Yes, that Chanel. You'll meet her soon, but not just yet. First, you must follow Dmitri into the heart of the plot that will define, and possibly doom, his name. You're in the darkened halls of the Moika Palace on a night dripping with vodka and vengeance. Dmitri is one of the men who helps plan the murder of Grigory Rasputin, the Siberian mystic who has become too powerful in the Romanov court, too close to Empress Alexandra, and too deeply despised by everyone else. Whether it's patriotism, fear, or pure ego, Dmitri joins Yusupov and others in luring Rasputin into a basement under the promise of wine and cake. You stand at the edge of the room as things spiral. Poison doesn't work. Bullets don't seem to either. It takes drowning to finish the job. This should have been a moment of heroism, or at least political clarity. But the backlash is immediate. The Tsar exiles Dmitri to the Persian front. And here's where history takes a strange left turn. Because while the Russian Revolution begins to smoulder, and the entire Romanov dynasty begins to collapse, Dmitri ends up in exile. Not just politically, but emotionally. You find him again in Paris, sometime in the early 1920s, during the Russian diaspora's champagne-splashed mourning period. The exiled Romanovs are everywhere, selling jewellery, opening ballet schools, drinking their past into oblivion. Dmitri moves through the salons and soirees like a ghost in tailored suits, polished and haunted. And this is where Coco Chanel finds him. She's at the height of her influence, still climbing, still ruthless, still cloaked in black and ambition. They meet through mutual friends, maybe at a gallery, maybe at a fashion show. It doesn't matter. You see the spark immediately. She sees in Dmitri a ruin she can wear. He sees in her a future with no titles. She teaches him how to dress less like a prince and more like a man. He teaches her how to speak Russian curses with a smile. The affair is brief, intense, and in its way, explosive. They vacation on the Riviera. You ride with them along the coast in a convertible, the wind pushing against time itself. They argue about literature, about love, about what it means to be exiled. Dmitri gives her Romanov pearls. She gives him freedom and perfume. Here's the quirky fact buried under fashion legends. Dmitri introduced Coco Chanel to the Russian perfumer Ernest Beau, who went on to help her create Chanel No. 5. So, in a way, one of the most iconic scents in history carries the ghost of a Romanov who once plotted a murder and kissed a woman who would become a global brand. But the romance fades. Dmitri drinks too much. The trauma he never talks about claws at his spine. Chanel needs movement, empire building, control. He can't offer any of that. You watch them part in silence, on a platform in Monte Carlo, not with heartbreak but with mutual understanding. Some loves aren't built to last, they're built to mark. Dmitri never returns to Russia. He never fully recovers. He drifts through Europe, occasionally appearing in photographs, older, sadder, still handsome. He marries eventually an American heiress, but it's never the same. He dies in 1942 in Switzerland quietly, surrounded by nurses, his Romanov blood thinned by years of survival. And here's the debate that still flickers among historians. Was Dmitri a hero for helping end Rasputin's hold on the court? Or did his actions accelerate the fall of the Romanovs by robbing the dynasty of its last scapegoat? Some say Rasputin's murder was the final blow. Others claim the revolution was inevitable, and Dmitri just wanted to matter before the curtain fell. Either way, he left a mark, in death and perfume. You walk past the fading remains of Moika Palace now, where the murder happened, and then through Paris, where Chanel's boutique still stands. No plaques mention Dmitri, no statue. But if you stand in the right shop and take a deep breath, you might still catch a whisper of something royal and ruined. Next, you're slipping back to the ancient world, to Egypt, where a queen's sister dares to love beyond what her bloodline allows. Her name has been half lost to time, but her defiance, that echoes through stone. You arrive in Egypt not by caravan or riverboat, but by slipping behind a curtain of sand and history into a world where even the stones breathe secrets. The desert presses down around you like a heavy veil, and ahead stands a temple, columns soaring into the pale blue sky, hieroglyphs dancing in sunlight, every carving echoing names we still whisper. This is the dynasty of Tutankhamun, of Hatshepsut, of Cleopatra. But tonight, you're drifting far from the names that make headlines and closer to the ones carved in corners. You're here for Ankhesenamun, the widow queen, and the forbidden love story buried with her. A sister, a bride, a survivor, and possibly, just possibly, the woman who tried to marry a foreigner to escape a dynasty cursed by its own blood. You find her at dusk, in a cool stone chamber scented with incense and sorrow. She's young, not yet 20, dressed in linen as fine as spider silk, her eyes lined with coal and resignation. Born royal? Yes. But that only meant her life belonged to politics, not to herself. Her father was Akhenaten, the infamous pharaoh who tried to destroy the old gods and replace them with Aten, the sun disk. Her mother? Probably Nefertiti, though the records get murky there, and even scholars argue over the details. What's certain is that Ankhesenamun grew up during a revolution, and by her teenage years she'd already married her own father. Then later her half-brother Tutankhamun. You know that name. Everyone does. The boy king, the golden sarcophagus, the mask. But few remember her, the girl queen standing beside him, carrying the weight of expectation and ritual on shoulders barely strong enough to bear it. You're there during their reign, brief as it was. They ruled together in a strange balance. He young and sickly, she poised and sharp. You catch a glimpse of their affection, playful touches in garden courtyards, offerings left for each other in temple alcoves. It isn't grand romance, but it's real. And when he dies suddenly at 18, she is shattered. Now she's alone, young, childless, and at the mercy of a royal court that feeds on marriage alliances like crocodiles in flood season. You're standing beside her as she makes the most desperate decision of her life, one still debated today. She writes a letter, not to a cousin, not to an Egyptian general, but to the king of the Hittites, Egypt's enemy to the north. She begs him to send one of his sons to marry her. "I will not take one of my own countrymen," she writes, a sentence so bold it practically crackles on the scroll. She offers the throne, she offers herself. You read the letter over her shoulder, watching her hands tremble. This isn't romance, this is rebellion. No Egyptian queen had ever done anything like it. For a woman raised to worship divine bloodlines, asking to marry a foreigner is not just unorthodox, it's treasonous. The Hittite king hesitates, then agrees. He sends his son, Prince Zananza. You wait with Ankhesenamun at the palace gate, heart pounding in tandem with hers as the days stretch into weeks. But Zananza never arrives. He's murdered en route, likely by an Egyptian faction horrified by the queen's audacity. Some say it was Horemheb, the general. Others suspect A, the aging vizier already plotting to marry her himself. Either way, the message is clear. She will not be allowed to choose her husband, or her fate. She disappears from the record soon after. No grand burial has ever been found. No monument stands in her name. You search temple walls, hoping for a sign, a scratched note in the margins, a carving of her face untouched by chisel. Nothing. It's as if she were erased. But you know better. You see her legacy in the walls that still whisper. You visit the ruins of Amarna, the city her father built for a god no one worships anymore, and you walk through the broken doorway of what may have once been her home. In the sand, you find a fragment of pottery, 2 figures painted in red ochre, hand in hand. It could be anyone, but it feels like her. Here's your curious little detail. Some scholars believe that Ankhesenamun's ring was found paired with eyes in a small tomb carving, suggesting she was forced to marry him after all, possibly as a last move to retain some semblance of power. But no records name her as his queen. No children are attributed to her. It's possible she was married, used, discarded, and then buried in a grave so modest it never even made the maps. And here's the scholarly debate that keeps Egyptologists up at night. Was Ankhesenamun's letter to the Hittite king a cry for love, or a desperate grasp at control? Some argue it was the first act of female diplomacy in ancient Egypt's history. Others say it was a mistake made by a terrified girl, and then there are those who believe she was assassinated not long after. Too bold, too unpredictable, too inconvenient to survive. Without her tomb, without her voice, we may never know. But you walk away with the sense that she was something rare in that era, aware of the game, and willing to risk it all to write her own ending. It didn't work. It rarely does. But in that one letter, still preserved on a Hittite tablet, her voice survives. You step back into the desert night, the stars cold and clear above the Valley of the Kings. Somewhere out there, beneath layers of sand and silence, she still waits to be found. A queen who broke the rules. A woman who tried to make herself heard in a world that demanded she stay silent. And now you're heading toward a different kind of exile. A love story written on the waves, not the walls, where a royal affair unfolds not in palaces but on the open sea. A British prince, a nameless sailor, and a passion so hidden it almost didn't leave a trace. The sea is black and endless when you arrive, the wind sharp and brined with secrets. You're aboard a Royal Navy vessel somewhere in the North Atlantic sometime in the 1930s, though no one's exactly sure when it begins, or even if it really happened. That's the problem with some royal love affairs. They're never shouted, never even whispered. They exist only in the margins, footnotes to footnotes, rumours that never die. This is one of those stories. A prince, a sailor, and the kind of affection so forbidden it couldn't even be named, let alone spoken aloud. The man at the heart of it is Prince George, Duke of Kent. Yes, the same George you last met brushing too close to Wallis Simpson. But his story, like so many royal ones, doesn't follow a single thread. Prince George is perhaps the most elusive Windsor of them all, glamorous, charming, a war hero, a patron of the arts, and always slightly out of step with royal expectations. He moves through the world like a man playing at being himself. Tall, blue-eyed, magnetic. People adore him. And yet you can tell he's always watching the door, half ready to run. You find him one night on the deck of a British naval cruiser, the waves hammering against the hull, his coat buttoned high and his collar turned to the wind. He's not alone. Standing beside him is a sailor, young, nameless to history but not to George. Their silhouettes lean close, too close for the strict decorum of the ship, too quiet for mere conversation. There's nothing dramatic, no kiss, no confession. Just a moment, sharp and quiet, in which something passes between them that neither dares name. It's wartime, or nearly so. Britain is restless, the monarchy even more so. George has already stirred scandal in ways the royal family barely contains. His name has been whispered in connection with dancers, poets, actresses, and, most precariously, men. You've heard the rumours, relationships hidden under nicknames and false identities, encounters tucked behind velvet curtains in London clubs. The problem isn't the attraction, it's the visibility. Being gay, or even suspected of being gay, in this era is more than taboo, it's a crime. For a Windsor, it's potentially lethal. But aboard the ship, with only the stars and sea as witnesses, the rules soften. You see the sailor pass him a tin of tea. You hear the gentle teasing in their voices. You feel it. The kind of intimacy that doesn't need to be romantic to be dangerous. Over the weeks they grow close. George takes evening walks just a little more often. The sailor's duties somehow always align with the prince's schedule. You notice the looks, and so do others. Word gets back to Whitehall. You're present in a meeting between naval brass and palace advisors. There's no open accusation, just a warning. Distance must be re-established. Assignments are shuffled. One day, the sailor is simply gone, reassigned to a different ship. George never speaks of it. Not to his friends, not to his wife, not even to his brothers. But that night, he doesn't go to dinner. He stands on deck, staring into the water, unmoving. Here's your strange little fact. Among George's personal effects, after his death, was found a silver cigarette case engraved with a name that doesn't match any royal or aristocratic figure. Just a first name, just enough to raise eyebrows. No one ever publicly connected it to any one person. But those who knew him knew better than to ask. And here's the scholarly debate, one that rages quietly behind closed academic doors. Was Prince George gay? Bisexual? Merely reckless with affection? Some argue he was deeply closeted, forced to perform heterosexuality under the brutal scrutiny of the royal family. Others suggest he was fluid before the word even existed, someone who followed feeling rather than convention. What's agreed upon is this: he was emotionally intense, deeply sensitive and often lonely, the kind of person who loved too much and in too many directions. He died young. 1942, a mysterious plane crash in Scotland, officially ruled an accident during wartime service, but the details have never quite added up. Witnesses say the flight deviated from its path. The weather wasn't bad. Some claim he insisted on being aboard last minute, and one version, quietly whispered in certain royal-adjacent circles, suggests that another man was on that plane, a man who wasn't listed on the passenger manifest, a man whose body was never officially identified. You stand now at the crash site years later, where the grass grows unevenly and the wreckage is long gone. There's a stone monument, modest and vague. It says nothing about the sailor, nothing about what might have been. But the wind here feels like memory, sharp, unforgiving. George is buried at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, his grave among others more famous and more sanitised. His name is rarely spoken today, his story often reduced to a paragraph. But you know what the history books don't say, that love, especially royal love, sometimes exists only in glances and half-finished conversations, and sometimes that's all it needs to leave a mark. Next, you're heading east again, into the golden palaces of Thailand, where a princess exchanges poems with a poet, and their quiet love story is erased as quickly as it blooms by both monarchy and war. Thailand greets you with golden rooftops and the scent of frangipani drifting through the humid air. Everything here is luminous, temples gleaming beneath a honey-coloured sun, monks in saffron robes moving silently along stone paths, the hum of prayer a steady undercurrent to city noise. But behind the serenity, behind the elaborate royal ceremonies and the crisp etiquette that governs every glance, there is a love story you're not supposed to know. It doesn't show up in history textbooks or on official tours of the Grand Palace. But if you lean close enough to the silence, if you listen carefully between the folds of formality, you'll hear her, Princess Vibhavadi Rangsit, and him, a poet, a pilot, a man without a title, whose name was once written on her heart like verse carved into stone. She's the daughter of Thai royalty, born into the House of Chakri in 1920, the kind of woman who should have followed the script. Debut at court, marriage to a nobleman, a life of carefully arranged appearances. But Vibhavadi never quite fit into that lacquered box. From a young age she wrote stories, essays, eventually novels. And poetry. Her words were quiet rebellions, cloaked in the elegance expected of her station, but you can feel the fire in them. She didn't just play the part of a royal woman, she edited it as she went. You first see her sitting at a lacquered writing desk, ink-stained fingers clutching a small envelope. It's a letter, one of many, and it's not addressed to anyone royal. It's meant for Air Force Lieutenant Prasit Thavorn, not a prince, not a general. Just a man with sharp eyes and a love for literature that mirrors her own. They'd met in intellectual circles, discussing politics and poetry, long before either of them was brave enough to name what was happening between them. You read her letters over her shoulder, delicate, poetic, filled with metaphors about flight and water and distance. I think of you when the wind touches my cheek, she writes, and wonder if you feel it too. Their affair, if it can even be called that, was quiet. There were no scandals, no midnight escapes, no broken engagements, just a slow, steady connection. You catch them sharing tea at the edge of a palace garden, their conversation drifting between war, literature, and the future neither of them dares to hope for. They write to each other constantly despite the risks. In Thailand, royalty is held above and apart. The idea of a princess loving a commoner isn't just unorthodox, it's legally and culturally taboo. But Vibhavadi is used to navigating between duty and defiance. She channels her energy into public service, travelling to the remote southern provinces on humanitarian missions. She brings medicine, food, and books to areas caught between government neglect and rebel tension. The monarchy lets her go, partly because she asks, partly because they don't know what else to do with a woman like her. You travel with her on one of those trips. The roads are rough, the air thick with monsoon heat, and yet she never once complains. She rides in a small military helicopter, sketching out logistics and pausing only to tuck a poem into her bag. It's on one of these missions that everything changes. The year is 1977. Political unrest is boiling beneath the surface. You're in the helicopter when it takes off from a southern base. With her are medics, supplies, and letters she hasn't yet mailed. She's heading into a province thick with insurgent activity. No one expects what happens next. Mid-flight, the helicopter is struck by gunfire. You feel the jolt as bullets tear through the fuselage. Screams, smoke. The world turns sideways. When the dust settles, Princess Vibhavadi is dead. The country mourns. She's declared a martyr, a hero, a symbol of royal sacrifice. The king posthumously bestows the title, Princess of Naradiwas. Statues are erected, schools named in her honour, but her love letters? Buried. Her connection to Prasit is never formally acknowledged. He attends her funeral as a civilian, says nothing, wears a blank expression, but you see the way he looks at her portrait, the way his hand lingers near the fabric of his uniform, as if he's hiding something just beneath the surface. Here's your strange little detail. In a box hidden at Prasit's family home, decades later, researchers uncovered several letters signed only with a single flower symbol. The same one Vibhavadi used in her published poetry. Most were burned, some were preserved. A few lines survived, enough to hint at something deeper, more personal, more dangerous than anyone had ever confirmed. One fragment reads, "I write you as the sky breaks open, I am not afraid. Not of them, only of forgetting." And the academic debate? It's barely even allowed. Thai royal history is closely guarded, with strict lèse-majesté laws that criminalise disrespect, or even too much curiosity, about the monarchy. Scholars who whisper about Vibhavadi's forbidden love do so behind closed doors, cautiously, eyes always darting toward the door. Was it love? Was it platonic admiration? A literary partnership? We may never know. But those letters, those fragments, say enough. Even in death, she resisted being simplified. You walk through her memorial garden in Narathiwat, where jasmine vines climb up carved wooden beams, and the air smells of salt and memory. No one talks about Prasit here. There are plaques for her public work, yes, but nothing about the man she wrote to in the dark, nothing about the lines they crossed in silence. But you've seen the letters, and now you carry them too, and next, you're stepping even further back in time, into the churning waves of the Adriatic, where a pirate queen rules with iron and charm, and where, just maybe, her fiercest ally was also her fiercest love. The sea doesn't whisper here, it roars, full of salt and rebellion. You find yourself on the deck of a creaking galley as it cuts through the dark waters of the Adriatic, the moon overhead pale and swollen. This isn't the domain of kings or bishops or powdered courtiers. This is the territory of pirates, specifically one pirate queen who commands both fear and fascination, Tutor of Illyria. And somewhere, not far from the crash of waves and the clang of swords, there's another figure who defies the usual script. A woman, name lost, title unknown, who may have been more than just Tutor's advisor, more than her captain, even more than her general. Tonight, you're sailing not just into war and resistance, but into a royal love story barely etched into the footnotes of history. The year is somewhere around 230 BCE, and Rome hasn't yet swallowed the Mediterranean whole. On the ragged coast of what's now Albania and Montenegro, the Illyrian tribes thrive on chaos. They raid Roman trade ships, collect tribute from Greek cities, and build their power from sea foam and strategy. At the helm of it all is Queen Tutor, widowed young and immediately, almost unnaturally, comfortable ruling alone. She wears bronze armour, speaks multiple languages, and holds counsel on a rocky outcrop where the wind makes your skin sting. You're there the first time she appears after her husband, King Agron, dies, draped in mourning black but carrying herself like a hawk. She doesn't stall for power, she takes it. The chieftains hesitate at first, but not for long. Because Tutor doesn't ask for loyalty, she demands it. But you notice something unusual almost immediately. She's never alone. Always just a pace or two behind her, a woman follows, slightly older, lean, quiet, but alert. She never speaks during council, but you see Tutor glance toward her often. A silent check-in, a flicker of something that isn't just tactical awareness. Her name, if it was ever officially recorded, has been lost. Some say she was a noble's daughter who joined Tutor's navy early. Others claim she was a former Greek slave freed by the queen herself. What's clear is that she's trusted, completely. And that trust, over time, becomes something else. You're on the galley with them one evening, sails fluttering like ribs against the sky. Tutor leans against the rail, watching the horizon. Her companion stands beside her, a hand resting lightly, just lightly, on the queen's arm. It's a moment so subtle you almost miss it, but not Tutor. She turns, just slightly, and their eyes lock. Not possession, not dominance, just recognition. The kind of look you only share with someone who has already seen every one of your edges. They live together, sail together, eat in the same chamber, fight in the same armour. The other commanders notice, of course. You hear the murmurs, but none dare question it, not because they accept it, but because Tutor gives them no choice. Her authority is absolute, and besides, she's winning. For a while, anyway. Rome doesn't tolerate chaos forever. After a particularly brutal raid on Roman merchants, the Senate sends envoys to demand that Tutor halt her piracy. You're in the audience chamber when one of the Roman ambassadors accuses her of arrogance unbefitting a woman. That's when it happens. Her jaw tightens, her fingers flex, and the next thing you know, one envoy is dead, the others fleeing, and Tutor's war with Rome has officially begun. Her companion doesn't leave her side once during the conflict. While the world remembers the legions and ships, you're watching something more intimate. Glances across the map table. Quiet conversations beneath blood-stained sails. Moments in the dark when the queen removes her armour and lets herself, for just a breath, lean against another body. It's not just comfort, it's connection. And in a world carved by violence, that connection is everything. Here's your fringe historical detail. In a fragment of Roman writing preserved in a later medieval codex, there's mention of a foreign woman whose tongue matched her blade, and whose counsel the Queen of Illyria held above all others. That line, ambiguous and tantalizing, is the closest we come to naming her. And here's the debate that divides classicists and feminist historians to this day. Was this woman simply a trusted military advisor, or was she Tutor's lover? Ancient texts are infuriatingly vague, written by men who either couldn't imagine women loving women, or refused to record it if they did. Some argue that this reading imposes modern sensibilities onto the past. Others, pointing to patterns of proximity, loyalty, and the absence of male consorts in Tutor's later years, argue that this wasn't just a political alliance, it was personal. But love doesn't always survive conquest. Rome eventually crushes Illyria. Tutor is forced to surrender. You watch as her territories are split, her fleets dismantled. She retreats to Rhizon, a shadow of her former power. Her companion vanishes from the historical record, not killed, not exiled, just gone. Some say she died in battle. Others believe she stayed behind in disguise, fighting on as a rebel. Tutor, reduced to a Roman client ruler, keeps her silence. You visit what's left of Reason now, modern-day Risen, where wildflowers grow among broken columns and the sea still murmurs against the rocks. No plaque marks her palace, no statue stands for her unnamed partner. But if you listen to the waves long enough, you'll hear a story of a queen who refused to bend, of a woman who walked beside her through fire and salt, of a love carved not in marble, but in movement. And now, you're heading toward the final pages of this history. The curtains are drawing close, but not before one last forbidden royal affair. This one happens in our own time, in palaces where the cameras never stop rolling, and where a crown prince risks everything for a woman the world already judged. The final act of this journey unfolds beneath the blinding flash of paparazzi bulbs and the low mechanical hum of rolling news cycles. You're no longer wading through ancient ruins or peeking behind velvet curtains. You're now in the polished, camera-ready present, where every smile is dissected, every gesture debated, and privacy is more mythical than any throne. Welcome to the modern monarchy. And tonight, the spotlight lands squarely on Crown Prince Haakon of Norway, and the woman he dared to love when the world, the media, and even his own court insisted he shouldn't. Her name is Mette-Marit Tjessem-Højby, and from the moment he said her name publicly, nothing in the Norwegian royal family would ever be the same. You arrive in Oslo in the late 1990s when the monarchy has mostly traded gold crowns for clean Scandi aesthetics, but the rules? Oh, they're still there. The king is expected to smile, wave, and quietly judge the lives of his children behind closed castle doors. The crown prince? He's young, popular, and painfully aware of what's expected of him. Marry well, stay neutral, and never, ever make headlines. But Haakon has always walked slightly off the prescribed royal path. You see it in his eyes. Curious, empathetic, restless. He meets Mette-Marit at a music festival. Yes, really. Not a palace gala, not a diplomatic dinner. A muddy, crowded music festival where beer spills and bass lines tremble through the grass. She's not what the press calls royal material. She's a single mother, born to working-class parents, and she's been very open about her past. Experimentation, parties, even time spent in Norway's underground rave scene. In short, she's exactly the kind of woman who's not supposed to stand next to a throne. But Haakon sees something else. He sees a woman who's survived things, who owns her scars instead of covering them. You're with them on their first quiet dates, dinners in hidden apartments, hikes in the forest where no one's looking. There's laughter, honest conversation, no performance. It's not a whirlwind romance, but something rarer, steady, grounded, real. And then he tells his family, and all hell breaks loose. You sit in on the internal meetings, advisors pacing, courtiers sighing, every newspaper in Scandinavia sharpening its knives. A crown prince marrying a single mom with a wild past? Absolutely not. You read the headlines. Unfit for a future queen. Haakon's heart over duty. The Norwegian royal household has always walked the tightrope between modern values and centuries-old structure. And this feels like stepping off the rope entirely. But Haakon doesn't flinch. In 2000, he proposes. And when he announces the engagement, Mette-Marit stands next to him, pale and composed, trembling slightly. But her voice? Strong, clear. She admits to her past. She apologizes to no one. I hope I'll be allowed to grow, she says, like anyone else. You watch the room exhale, and then hold its breath again. The wedding, in 2001, is a study in contradictions. The Norwegian people remain split, half inspired, half scandalized. But as she walks down the aisle, veil trailing, Haakon smiles like a man who knows exactly what he's doing. In that moment, tradition bows its head, just a little. But the real test isn't the wedding, it's what comes after. You follow them through the quiet years, the ones the press doesn't care much about, the awkward state dinners, the learning curve of royal protocol, the way Mette-Marit gently folds herself into a role that was never designed for someone like her. She works quietly with HIV/AIDS organisations, focuses on children's rights, becomes a UN Goodwill ambassador, all while raising her son from a previous relationship and 2 more children born into royal expectation. But the scrutiny doesn't stop. The press still pokes holes. Critics still mumble. You overhear gossip at elite events, even years later, about that woman Haakon married. And yet, he never wavers. In every speech, every appearance, he stands beside her. Sometimes literally in front of her, if the crowd gets too loud. When asked, he always gives the same answer. She's the love of my life. Here's your curious little fact. When Haakon and Mette-Marit toured the US in 2005, they included a stop not just at the White House or the UN, but at a Brooklyn youth shelter. She requested it herself. No fanfare, just time spent with girls whose stories echoed her own. And here's the scholarly tug-of-war that still pops up in constitutional debates and opinion columns. Did Hakon's choice weaken the crown, or modernise it? Some argue that marrying Mette-Marit chipped away at the gravitas expected of royalty, that it blurred the line between monarchy and celebrity. Others say it was the smartest thing he ever did, that by embracing someone real, with a past, he made the monarchy relevant in a way it hadn't been in decades. Mette-Marit has faced health struggles in recent years, including a diagnosis of chronic pulmonary fibrosis. But still, she works. Still, she shows up. And Haakon, he's right there with her, hand on her back, a silent partner in every room. Their relationship isn't fairy tale perfect. It's flawed, evolved, and lived in, which is probably why it's lasted. You leave them now in their Oslo residence, light spilling through large windows, the room filled with the quiet clutter of family. A dog naps in the corner. Books pile up. There's a half-finished puzzle on the table, no crowns in sight, no scripts. Just two people who dared to make room for something real in a palace built on centuries of pretending. And now your journey through the most forbidden royal love affairs in history draws to a close. But before you drift off, let's take a final moment to breathe it all in. Every crown dropped, every kiss hidden, every whispered vow that never made it into the official records. And now here you are, standing on the edge of it all. 30 stories of stolen glances, whispered confessions, and enough royal rule-breaking to make an entire line of monarchs roll in their velvet-lined graves. You've crossed empires tonight, slipped between curtains in Ottoman harems, and danced across cold moonlit decks with exiled princes. You've followed love through poison plots, across borders, through war zones, and into courtrooms, battlefields, and bedrooms, all without ever putting on shoes. Nice work. But here's what lingers now, as the lights go low and your thoughts start to drift. Love, even in its most chaotic, inconvenient, and completely forbidden form, has a habit of finding cracks in the armour. It slips past palace guards, it ignores bloodlines, it survives exile, scandal, and even time. You've seen it survive despite politics, survive because of it, or in some cases die loudly when it tried to ask for too much. And it's not always pure, it's often messy, sometimes strategic, sometimes unbalanced. You've watched queens use romance to gain power, and you've seen kings throw it all away just to have one more hour with someone the world said they couldn't have. You've met mistresses who shaped history and lovers whose names were scratched out of it. You've heard stories that historians still argue about over wine and sighs and scanned letters with burned edges. But the thread that binds them all is that someone, somewhere, said no, and someone else didn't listen. And maybe that's the real magic. That defiance, that soft, stubborn heartbeat that says, I choose this, even when the world has other plans. So now, close your eyes, let the crowns fall off, let the swords clatter to the ground, forget the titles, just remember the people, the trembling hands, the eyes across the room, the risks they took, the ones who survived, the ones who didn't. They were never supposed to love like this, but they did anyway. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made them royal.